first humans to ever use psychedelics in history is widely debated and discussed in the worldwide entheogen communities. Terence McKenna pioneered the idea that early prehistoric man found and ate psychedelic mushrooms, which became a stepping stone for cognitive evolution, allowing humanity to emerge as the powerful mental beings that we have become today. This would have taken place in Africa and been at the fundamental basis for shamanism and animism, the earliest forms of spiritual beliefs on the planet that we know of today. Events such as these are, of course, not recorded in history, and thus are only theories at this time. It's important to note that, until we actually have a recorded history placing tangible dates on psychedelic usage, many of these dates are theories, and in theory, they could have been used a lot earlier in history as well. That said, support for this idea is found in the numerous cave paintings found around the world dating back as early as 40,000 years, and seeming to depict a very similar pattern of geometric waves emerging from the minds of the various indigenous people, as well as humanoid figures with mushroom heads. The first tangible evidence of psychedelic cultivation is debated, some claiming to find evidence of cannabis and psychedelic mushroom cultivation as early as 15,000 BC across Asia, where the more concrete evidence lies in 8,000 BC in Taiwan, with twisted strands of hemp being used in the making of patterns on clay pots. As early as 4000 BC, we find more evidence of the Amanita muscaria mushrooms used by the shamans of Siberia. Around the same time and shortly thereafter, we see evidence of various psychedelics being used for spiritual practices in ancient Egypt. The blue lotus flower was revered along with the Amanita muscaria mushroom for their psychedelic and trance-inducing properties. Meanwhile, in the Amazon jungle, evidence of ayahuasca is seen as early back as 3000 BC. By around 2800 BC, the Chinese tradition holds that hemp and cannabis cultivation officially began being grown both for its fiber as well as the medical properties of cannabis itself. It was used as a treatment for malaria, beriberi, constipation, rheumatic pains, absent-mindedness, and menstrual cramps. During the classical period of ancient Greece, in roughly 1700 BC, the Greek mysteries emerged as an evolution from the ancient Egyptian mystery schools, which became widely popular, and they used a substance called kykeon after several days of fasting, which led to profound visions, giving the initiates an understanding of life after death. In 1500 BC, the Rig Vedas were written in India, talking about a plant/god called soma introduced by the Aryans. There is not too much known about this, except that based on the writings, it's highly likely that soma was a potent psychedelic drink of some kind, of immense importance to spiritual ceremonies. It was known for increasing awareness, imparting mystical experiences, poetic inspiration, and even immortality. In 1200 BC, a substance called bhang, made up of dried cannabis leaves, seeds, and stems, are mentioned in the verses of the Hindu Atharva Veda as one of the 5 sacred plants of India. Around 1000 BC, some of the original ideas of Judaism were written down for the first time. Of course, it has been speculated by many historians that many of these traditions were passed down orally for a very long time. In a newly emerging theory, the concept of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil are believed to be the combination of the Siberian birch and the Amanita muscaria mushroom, which often grow symbiotically together. During this same time period, we see that peyote and San Pedro cacti were discovered and used by the American Indian shamans on the Western continent, as well as many stones carved into magic mushrooms appearing in the Mesoamerican cultures, beginning with the Olmecs and stretching through the Incas, Mayas, and other Mesoamerican cultures for the next 2,500 years. Psychedelics in Greece continued to be used for another 1,000 years in different forms, too. In 800 BC, at the Temple of Apollo in Greece, priestesses would deliver messages from Apollo while intoxicated with smoke from henbane seeds. And in 700 BC, Herodotus described Scythians entering into Eastern Europe from Asia and introduced cannabis for the first time. In the 1st century AD, Josephus Flavius writes about the supernatural properties of mandrake, and Pliny the Elder discusses hemp at great length, completing his book Natural History in 77 AD. Though it's widely debated, there is evidence now that even Jesus Christ himself used cannabis oil in his healings. A substance called cannabosum is mentioned several times in the Hebrew Bible, and recent investigations have led to the discovery that this substance was most likely made up of cannabis oil. In the 4th century AD, Christianity became the legal religion of the Roman state and dogmatically condemned all other beliefs. Mankind entered into the Dark Ages, yet hemp cultivation became very popular in Europe for the next 600 years. Use and abuse of hashish became widespread and eventually was suppressed. By 1000 AD, European contact in China caused shamanism to decline, and along with it, the psychoactive use of cannabis, though it was still cultivated for its fiber. In 1500, this European culture sailed to the Americas and destroyed the Aztec Empire, beginning the Spanish colonies in the Americas. After the Renaissance, between the 14th to the 17th centuries, there is now widespread discussion, though in smaller, focused groupings of people discussing and exploring psychedelics in all manner of forms. Everything from mushrooms to cacti, and of course cannabis, were discussed and written about all over the world in various formats. However, due to the Dark Ages, there was still a general religious stigma around them, and often those who cultivated or practiced with these plants were labeled as warlocks and witches, or considered crazy. As the white, largely Christian culture moved west and took over North America, Native American use of psychedelics were suppressed and demonized as well. Although as integrations of cultures did happen, by the 20th century many groups of people formed organizations to support their spiritual uses, such as the Native American Church, being formed around the protection of the use of peyote cactus in spiritual ceremony. In 1938, LSD is created and discovered, and the earliest psychiatric experiments with it begin by 1948. In 1951, the first CIA experiments of the psychological effects of LSD began. In 1957, Life magazine published a story on psychedelics, which was one of the first major boosts of popularization of psychedelics in America. Shortly thereafter, psychedelics become widely popular in America during the 60s, before the American government shuts it down through the 70s, and they once again become a taboo subject. Nevertheless, psychedelic use has prevailed through the course of its suppression, and people still find themselves interested in the secrets of the mind, which psychedelics have been demonstrated to unlock. Today, and thanks to the power of the internet, information about psychedelics has become widespread, and the information can no longer be contained. Many documentaries are created, leading to a newfound global respect for psychedelics, shamanism, and the power of the mind. Hey, thanks for tuning in to the Spirit Science Psychedelic Movie. This project is brought to you by our psychedelic master course called Spirit Medicine Walkers. With over 30 hours of content, interviews from shamans, scientists, and taught by trained experts in psychedelic knowledge, this course will teach you everything you need to know about what psychedelics are, how they work, where they take you, how to navigate the psychedelic state, dealing with the dark side of psychedelics, integration after a ceremony, and so much more. To find out more about Spirit Medicine Walkers, use the link in the description and come experience it for yourself today. Thank you so much for this brief interlude, and please enjoy the rest of the movie. Life lived in the absence of the psychedelic experience that primordial shamanism is based on is a life trivialized, denied, and enslaved to the ego. The 60s. You know, today when we often look back at this time and think, yeah, man, it was groovy. We had the Beatles, Hendrix, and Woodstock. Right on, bro. But the reality of the day was that it was mostly a whole lot of Vietnam War, civil rights protests, MLK and JFK assassinations, and that time we almost descended into nuclear war with the missile crisis down in Cuba. Someone should have just yelled, Jumanji, and got it over with real fast. But hey, Eisenhower probably would have lied about that too. But yet in the darkest depths of those years, something was waiting for us at the bottom, ready to guide us back and set us free. We're of course talking about the psychedelic renaissance, spearheaded by Albert Hofmann's synthetic hallucinogen LSD. Whether you partook in an LSD trip or not at the time, if you were even alive, there's no denying that the 60s and its counterculture of consciousness exploration was forged on its anvil. LSD's aura, if not its substance, was a huge component of the air that you breathed and the fabric of the streets that you walked. This hallucinogen infused the exhalations of musicians, philosophers, advertisers, and activists, and gave birth to one of the most beautiful experiences humanity has ever known, and turned the youth of the nations against their oppressors. So in the words of the infamous neuronaut Timothy Leary, turn on, tune in, and drop out, as we explore just how much LSD and psychedelics shaped the 60s. Whenever you ask anyone about the 60s, you'll probably get a list that involves hippies, minivans, bell-bottom jeans, and people dropping buckets of acid. Or if you're a bit more widely read, you might group those things into part of the counterculture. But before we can talk about LSD, we need to look at just why the idea of a counterculture came up at all, and why exploring consciousness became so popular in the first place. The short answer is, much like today, that many young people started to think the government and established systems of authority were lying to them and didn't have their best interests at heart. So they began exploring their hearts themselves. Funny how history repeats itself. The previous decade was pretty much defined by the Cold War between the capitalist states of the US and the communist ones of the Soviet Union.
But no one really fought that honorably, and the whole thing kind of boiled down to, well, my nukes are bigger than yours. Oh yeah? Prove it. No, you. And there was a lot of spying and espionage involved, but sometimes didn't work out very nicely for some of the poor countries, which all the people who happened to be coming of age around that time saw and began to question. If the government was spying and interfering so much, who or what else could they be spying on? The infamous Port Huron student statement encapsulated the vibe of late teenage angst, saying, "We are people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit." Kicking off the decade with a bang, President Eisenhower was caught out over the U-2 incident, where the US claimed they simply sent a weather plane to Russia when it was actually a spy plane. And the Russians played a reverse Uno card by showing everyone pictures of it, which resulted of the US government being caught in a blatant lie at the highest level. Then 3 years later, JFK was assassinated, which led to a bunch of conspiracy theories that the CIA was pulling strings and planning things behind the scenes. And if you want to dive down that rabbit hole of stuff like MKUltra, check out our Conspiracy Theory of Everything movie before it's banned again. But in the words of Avatar Aang,
when we hit our lowest point, we are open to the greatest change.
While all of this was going on at the top level of society, other elements, especially the students at universities, were starting to wake up to the importance of civil rights and treating people fairly. You could even say that the next generation were going through a consciousness shift of their own. People began to think more about funding anti-poverty programs to look after the most vulnerable. And with the work of people like Rachel Carson, the growing threat of industrialization and pollution on the planet, especially with pesticides in the food market, started to weed its way into popular consciousness despite resistance from the establishment. On another level, around the 60s, birth control started to get more easily available, which, coupled with the rise of neo-tantra, meant young people were having way more sex just for the sake of it, rather than for reproduction, because there wasn't as much threat of unwanted pregnancy, which meant both women and men had more freedom to choose sexual partners outside of the traditional marriage that defined their parents' era. It was in this environment that LSD burst into the scene. There was nothing counter about the 60s counterculture. Believe me, it was weaved into every level of society and was on almost every street. You know how if you go to Amsterdam today, there's almost as many cannabis shops as there are Starbucks? Yeah, imagine that going on while acid rock and the Beatles were blaring in every dark corner, and psychedelic album covers like Cream Wheels of Fire were being posted on every wall. It was groovy, man. It wasn't just the visuals and feelings of LSD that captured the hearts of people though. The drug acquired a status of almost divine power that could initiate you into the inner mysteries of the universe. If you don't know about the story about how Albert Hofmann created LSD in the first place, I encourage you to check out Netflix's The Mind Explained episode on psychedelics. But needless to say, when he accidentally ingested too much on his second attempt and had the world's first bad acid trip, one that involved a bike ride from hell and him drinking basically a cow's worth of milk, don't ask, he came out of it saying it felt like a demon had invaded me, taken possession of my body, mind, and soul. But yet the next day, everything glistened in a fresh light. The world was as if newly created. The heads of the counterculture referenced this idea and saw the potential for enlightenment and liberation, something that was already being dramatically pushed in every level of society. There's a long tradition of ancient heroes from mythology descending into the underworld to acquire new knowledge. Both Odysseus and Aeneas did it in their epic poems, the Odyssey and the Aeneid. But to the young people of 60s America, LSD offered a chance to travel to their own underworld and emerge with a new sense of being that echoed their newly emerging world. In other words, the essence of the counterculture became descend into madness and emerge enlightened, seeing the world anew as the heroes of old once did. This mythic attribution of LSD was echoed in the works of Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert when they intricately weaved together their book, The Psychedelic Experience, that sought to be a kind of acid trip guide that was based off the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The idea was to read it to a person tripping to deepen their experience and allow them to find new landscapes of reality. Its opening lines even begin, "O Voyager, the time has come for you to seek new levels of reality. Your ego and the name game are about to cease. You are about to be set face to face with the clear light." All sounds very biblical. That's because it was. As far as they were concerned, LSD was the bridge to God, giving you the ability to return ready to change the world with your new knowledge. It's important to remember though, this fascination with LSD had been building since its discovery, and the mainstream view wasn't always negative. As Dr. Hoffman pointed out in his memoir, Sandoz Laboratories, seeing no obvious medical purposes for the drug initially provided it completely free to researchers, leading to nearly 100 scientific papers appearing annually that were mostly pretty positive. But in 1965, when patents had expired and accounts of bad trips and widespread use had made LSD a serious threat to the public health, the company announced it was stopping production. To its creator, LSD's overuse and abuse in recreational environments was what led to its illegality. Mainstream governments began to see it as a drug that was destroying their old and dying world, upsetting the traditional values of the Western middle class, which resulted in quick action to restrict the availability by making any use of it illegal. But this action almost single-handedly created one of the biggest spiritual screw yous by the universe ever. Everything changed in 1967 when the Fire Nation, wrong episode, when the infamous Human Being Festival exploded like a tidal wave of pure spiritual force in San Francisco to protest the bill that made LSD illegal. Organized by artist Michael Bowen, it called together tons of famous philosophers and speakers like Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, Alan Watts, and poets like Allen Ginsberg, who chanted mantras and gave talks on the drug to explain how it could work to create change, peace, and love in the world. Coupled with live music from people like Jefferson Airplane and Grateful Dead, the whole festival centered around personal empowerment, cultural and political decentralization, communal living, ecological awareness, and exploring higher consciousness, culminating in the very thing that later defined the 60s altogether. This was the movement that gave birth to hippies and told the mainstream media that the culture of expanding consciousness was here to stay. Following the festival boom, the spiritual energy showed no sign of slowing down, and within the same year, a few months later, the Summer of Love kicked off in full force, drawing nearly 100,000 people together in the neighborhood of Haight-Ashbury, which became psychedelic culture's ground zero, helped in part by the famous psych rock artists like Jimi Hendrix, Pink Floyd, and the Byrds, who got the media even more interested. When people finally came down from their highs and came home from the Summer of Love, they were never again the same. Their minds had been opened by LSD, and they had seen the new age that was emerging. Some hippies even began to form communes to live as far outside of the established system as possible to try and reject active political engagement with the mainstream, and, following Leary's to turn on, tune in, and drop out, hoped to change society by dropping out of it altogether. But how did Eastern mysticism, 20th century psychiatry research, New Age politics, and 19th century romanticism become so intertwined? The answer lies in the famous shaman professors who guided their students to experiment in the first place. When Aldous Huxley wrote about his experience with mescaline and peyote in The Doors of Perception, his title was taken straight from the 19th century romantic poet William Blake, when he said, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." See, the romantics in the 19th century were pushing for an alternate culture that might displace the encroaching industrial age way before it was cool. To them, cold reason would be tempered by visionary warmth, objective science by internal experience. Hoffman even sounded like a romantic poem himself a few times, saying that he believed LSD could reveal the miraculous, powerful, unfathomable reality that was hidden from everyday sight. To the counterculturalists, there was a crisis in society, not one that could be solved by increased taxes or a better property market, because it was a spiritual crisis. The old world was dying, and the coming new age required a shift away from the material and back to nature to reconnect with ourselves. In that way, LSD became a political tool as much as a spiritual one. It offered a physical means of dissent with the mainstream and the promise of a reformation as a tool of awakening. But as awesome as this sounded, it didn't quite go to plan. If you look around the world today, it still hasn't. As the hippie movement grew older and the people who practiced it mellowed out as they aged, the counterculture was largely absorbed by the mainstream, but not before leaving a lasting impact on philosophy and society as a whole. It's kind of funny, even though the LSD culture of the 60s stressed a return to nature, away from technology and objective science, it's only through science that LSD's prophetic visions have really become realized. Before founding Apple, Steve Jobs ranked his LSD experience as one of the most important times in his life. And while Jeff Bezos hasn't ever publicly acknowledged taking psychedelics, DMT, or other potent entheogens that come from plants and animals, often found from the literal Amazon, then you have his Amazon, the everything store that supports massive amounts of human experience and knowledge on its cloud servers that are now starting to listen and see everything too. So maybe someone did tune in and drop out. Nevertheless, it's safe to say that LSD, whether it's seen in society or hidden in the undercurrent outside of the public mainstream view. There's no question that it's played its role in shaping our society in a very powerful way. Hello everyone, great to see you. As you're probably aware, Canada just legalized cannabis. As residents of this country, the Spirit Science crew felt that there was no better time for us to open up and talk about cannabis and its influence in our lives and the world. Truth is, for a really long time, I found it difficult to discuss cannabis and other types of psychoactive plants because they're illegal! So I often kept the conversation on the down low, choosing to focus on other things with Spirit Science. However, it's such an important conversation because cannabis can serve as a powerful bridge between spirituality and science, or experience and measurement. Now, there is a brilliant man named David Schmader who recently did a TED Talk called Stoners Coming Out, which sets the stage for this conversation in a really articulate way.
Have you ever really looked at your hand? I tell that joke because according to lore, people high on marijuana are amazed by their limbs, often while slow-motion speed-eating Doritos in their parents' basement. I hate this joke because it invokes a stereotype that is reductive at best and supports a system of diabolical lies at worst. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is David Schmader, and I am a pothead. By this, I mean that when it comes time to enjoy an adult intoxicant, I will forego beer, wine, and spirits in favor of marijuana, which for me offers a world of nuanced delight and inspiration beyond the more crude effects of booze. But I am not here to proselytize, and for a long time, I kept quiet about my own enjoyment of weed. It was illegal for most of the time I was enjoying it, and why make myself vulnerable as an out and proud lawbreaker if I didn't have to? I also dreaded being saddled with the stoner stereotype of having my every move interpreted through the lens of pothead. So what if I used weed not to escape, but to engage with art and ideas and food and dogs and hilariously terrible movies? I was but one man, and I couldn't reconfigure society's image of the pothead all by myself.
This talk is relevant for several reasons. The first is that now that cannabis is becoming legalized, we have to change and evolve our stereotypes and our understanding of what it is, which is one of the purposes of this very Spirit Science episode. The other thing he mentioned though, about using cannabis to engage with art and ideas and what have you, is something I want to bring our focus to. This concept I recently heard elsewhere, but in an entirely different way. It was the scientist, Dr. Alan Lightman, who said something very similar in a debate that he had with Richard Dawkins. This will probably seem unrelated at first, but I promise we'll bring it back around.
And I lay down in the boat and looked up at the sky. And after a few minutes, I felt that I had dissolved into that star-littered sky. I felt like I was falling into infinity. I felt like I was becoming part of the stars. My body disappeared, the boat disappeared. And the vast expanse of time from the long distant past, long before I was born, to the long distant future, long after I would be dead, that vast expanse of time seemed compressed to a dot. I felt like I was connected not only to the stars, but to all of nature and the entire cosmos. I felt a merging with something much bigger than myself. And after a while, I sat up and started the engine again. Well, I would imagine that many of you have had similar experiences, and I'll call it the transcendent experience. The transcendent experience cannot be understood quantitatively or logically. Certainly not in the manner in which a physicist can calculate how many seconds it will take a ball to hit the floor when dropped from a height of 2 meters. When I was lying in that boat in Maine looking up at the sky at night, you could have hooked up every one of my 100 billion neurons to a vast computer and gotten the electrical readout on every single one of them, and you still would not have remotely understood the feeling that I had.
Ah, thank you, Alan. That was beautiful. Now, this had absolutely nothing to do with cannabis. I choose to share this with you today, though, because I believe it explains a beautiful phenomenon of life, a sense of quantum conscious engagement, where you experience something beyond yourself in a profound way. To bridge the spirit and the science, all we have to do is look to Dr. Carl Sagan. Most people don't know this, but this famous scientist was actually a closeted advocate for cannabis and its legalization, and spoke on it as something which helped him to better understand himself, art, music, and lovemaking. This is how what Dr. Lightman said is relative to the cannabis conversation, because cannabis, while not really a psychedelic in the traditional sense, does offer an experience which can be deeply moving and powerfully healing, if used properly.
Cannabis, in my view, is another of the great and powerful teacher plants. We cannot really argue that cannabis is a psychedelic, although at high dosages, particularly with individuals who are not experienced with cannabis, the experience is pretty close to a full-on psychedelic experience. It can be. The natural world has been bounteous to us. It has provided us with, well, of course, all our food and clothing and everything comes out of nature, and it's provided us with these substances that alter consciousness as well, which humanity has had a long relationship with.
As a young patchling, the first time I ever used cannabis, it allowed me to fully relax and wind down, which really helped me during a time when I had a lot of built-up anger from bullying and repression. Later on in life, cannabis was really the medicine I needed to have my first real transcendental experience, which to me felt exactly like the story that Alan Lightman just described. Ultimately, this experience is what eventually led to the creation of spirit science. Today, my heart sings with joy that we're socially allowed to talk about this out in the open without it feeling weird. It's a breath of fresh air. Cannabis has been used in a multitude of ways in our lives. It produces food, fabric, clothing, paper, cosmetics, paints, biofuels, and building materials. And that's not even counting its variety of uses as a medicine or its value as a spiritual tool. The use of cannabis goes back thousands of years and is one of the oldest plant medicines in recorded history, with evidence of it being used in 8000 BCE and signs that we grew it as a crop as early as 5000 BCE. Many theorists, Carl Sagan included, use this to suggest that it might have been the original plant we ever started growing at the birth of agriculture.
The use of cannabis can basically be followed by the spread of Indo-European language, and we're talking about the root language of French, German, English, Sanskrit, wherever it goes, as soon as it's there, it starts taking on new names, the giver of delights, the end of sorrow, the gift, the secret, all these different names start coming into play.
In ancient China, a non-psychoactive strain of Cannabis sativa, also known as industrial hemp, was grown for its medicinal and practical properties. In ancient India, Cannabis indica was grown and written about for its transcendent effects. It made its way through Egypt and was grown throughout the rise of Europe. In fact, when European settlers came to the Americas, it was grown for the conquest and expansion of the American Empire. Even George Washington grew it. Like, it was so important to the developing United States that they actually put it on their $10 bill. That stuff they're farming? That's Cannabis sativa. So how did it become illegal? In a word, racism. In a few words, racism and control. In the early 1900s, an influx of Mexican immigrants came to the US. With them came the practice of smoking cannabis recreationally, and it took off.
Talk it up, man.
Many early prejudices against cannabis were really just thinly veiled racist fears of its smokers, often made worse by reactionary newspapers such as those owned by the Hearst chain. The African American community also began to pick up on cannabis, so that reinforced this racial fear, feeding into the stereotype that was used to make it illegal in the 1930s. Now, this is where our story gets interesting, and even a bit scandalous. To be clear, many cannabis historians have written about this, but it is a historical theory, as there are some parts which are difficult to prove. The story goes that in the early 1900s, there was a large industry that was rapidly emerging in America: cars. This industry required a lot of different parts to produce: metals, fabrics, rubbers, etc. Now enter a man named Andrew Mellon. He was the US Secretary of Treasury, who also happened to be the head of Mellon Bank. It is believed that Mellon Bank had a large investment in DuPont Petrochemical and helped them to acquire General Motors, the makers of cars. At that time, DuPont was also involved with the development of nylon, a synthetic fiber made from fossil fuels. The story says that Andrew Mellon saw an opportunity for his monopoly to grow, but also saw that cannabis hemp, being so useful, could take business away from DuPont, making a lot of different materials needed for these cars. So he got a job for his nephew-in-law, Harry Anslinger, who took the lead position of the Department of Prohibition in Washington, D.C. in 1929. However, the prohibition of alcohol was a disaster, ending only 13 years after it began. Anslinger then found himself in charge of a huge government department that had nothing to do. Up until that point, he had said that cannabis didn't harm people or make people violent. But then, suddenly, when his department needed a new purpose, Anslinger announced that he had changed his mind. Keep in mind, a lot of people in power back then were deeply racist people. The government began putting out outrageous, racist, and derogatory claims, such as that cannabis made men of color try to solicit sex from white women, and that it caused you to fall into a delirious rage, eventually making you go insane. They called it marijuana, the weed with roots in hell. This created tremendous fear and hate towards both cannabis and ethnic minorities. Cannabis was made illegal, and it remained this way for a very long time. Now, right around the time that this whole thing happened, DuPont filed its patent on nylon, and this synthetic fiber took over a large part of the textile and cordage markets that otherwise would have gone to the hemp industry. More than half the American cars on the road were built by GM, which DuPont had massive shares in at the time, and they began producing all of the paints, varnishes, plastics, and rubbers for these cars, all of which could have been made by hemp. For the record, yes, hemp plastic and hemp rubber are very real and very useful. In fact, Henry Ford made an entire car out of hemp. And finally, all GM cars would subsequently be designed to use tetraethyl-leaded fuel exclusively, which contained additives that DuPont manufactured. It's interesting because the original diesel engine was designed to run off of vegetable and seed oils, and hemp was at the top of that list. Now, I ask that we look at this story with speculation and scrutiny, because there's probably a ton of information that we don't yet have. And there are also those who claim that this is all just a fanciful story and nothing more. Now, regardless of whether there's an actual conspiracy or not, the amount of racist hatred from back then seems to be an undercurrent of the entire thing, fueling almost a century of misinformation, lies, and restrictive control. Stigma around cannabis only got worse from there. In the 1970s, the Controlled Substances Act was established, which put cannabis into the most restrictive category, Schedule 1, which is said to be highly addictive with no medicinal value. There was a bipartisan commission in 1973 to decriminalize cannabis, but Richard Nixon denied the bill and started the war on drugs instead, essentially to bully political enemies and continue the discrimination. John Ehrlichman, the White House Domestic Affairs Advisor between 1969 and 1973, is quoted as saying,
"We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did."
Why? Fast forward to today. One of the biggest reasons for cannabis finally returning to legalized status is largely thanks to the influence of the internet and its ability to spread information swiftly around the world. An overwhelming quantity and quality of medical studies have now reached the minds of millions. These studies have demonstrated that cannabis has tremendous medicinal value and is significantly less harmful and addictive than other legal substances such as alcohol and tobacco. Unlike alcohol and tobacco, which have death tolls of roughly 88,000 and 480,000 people per year, cannabis has actually never killed anyone. However, it's important to know that the studies have also found that when smoked heavily every single day, you're more likely to have a poor verbal memory compared to those who smoke less, or not at all. Much like tobacco, inhaling any smoke is carcinogenic, and cannabis smoke is no different. This smoke, especially in large quantities, can lead to lung health problems throughout one's life. Ultimately, overuse or abuse of cannabis or anything can lead to negative outcomes. When participating in something that changes your mental state, there is the potential that you might think or behave differently than you normally do, which could be fun or not. Anyways, getting into the medicine. Beginning in 1974, researchers at the Medical College of Virginia learned that medical cannabis was able to shrink brain tumors in rats. This study was very much overlooked by the Nixon administration, and since then, the world has seen more and more studies coming out showing the benefits of cannabis. Here are just a few quotes from a scientific publication called The Health Effects of Cannabis and Cannabinoids, written in 2017. There is substantial evidence that cannabis is an effective treatment for chronic pain in adults. There is conclusive evidence that oral cannabinoids are effective antiemetics in the treatment of chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. There is substantial evidence that oral cannabinoids are an effective treatment for improving patient-reported multiple sclerosis spasticity symptoms. The Cannabo Medical Clinic has cited that the 10 most common conditions that medical cannabis is prescribed for are multiple sclerosis, spinal cord injury, spinal cord disease, cancer, HIV and AIDS, arthritis, epilepsy, inflammatory bowel disease, end-of-life care, and insomnia. The United Patients Group, a company dedicated to offering education about and supporting medical cannabis use, has listed over 150 different diseases and illnesses that have been effectively treated with medical cannabis. Now, this company does say, though, not to self-diagnose, but instead recommends speaking with an open-minded physician to see if cannabis is a good fit to improve the specific condition that you're dealing with. Now, if cannabis can really help with all of these diseases and illnesses, what exactly is it in the plant that has such healing properties? In the composition of cannabis, there are hundreds of chemical compounds that act upon the various receptors throughout the brain and body. At least 100 of these compounds are called cannabinoids, and 2 of the most commonly discussed ones are CBD and THC. Interestingly enough, our own bodies actually produce their own cannabinoids through our endocannabinoid system, which is why we have receptors for them in the first place. CBD, short for cannabidiol, is one of the leading reasons for the healing effects of cannabis. CBD does not get you high, but instead causes therapeutic actions through more indirect means in the body, by influencing the body to use its own endocannabinoid system more effectively. Because of this, it is known to be a promising potential therapy for many different things, including epilepsy, MS, ALS, Parkinson's, acne, diabetes, ADHD, and so much more.
Personal trainer and podcast host Ben Greenfield has been using this plant to aid in his highly competitive sports lifestyle.
And I initially found cannabis and frankly CBD, not even THC, to be useful for that. I began microdosing with smaller amounts prior to workouts. CBD is an interesting molecule in that there's a host of research now on not just the relaxation and the anti-inflammatory effects, but also the beneficial hormonal effects, the beneficial effects on muscle response to training, the beneficial effects on everything from testosterone to a slight increase in fat mobilization to all sorts of things that serve an athlete well. You know, when you look at something like off-season use of cannabis, I began to realize that THC, you know, the more psychoactive component, is actually something that served me quite well for writing and for creativity. And so I would say that from a creative production standpoint, I've found that both micro and admittedly macro dosing with THC has been something that's been really helpful in that regard.
Cannabis, in my opinion, can be used as a performance-enhancing drug. It tends to help me elicit flow states more readily, kind of calms my mind, helps me relax, but the mental clarity that really comes from it is probably why I microdose anything, is for that mental clarity, really getting out of my own way, stopping the self-judgment, stopping the self-criticism. Those are really my biggest barriers.
Flow states are spoken about intensively in Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheal's books, The Rise of Superman and Stealing Fire. They are typified by the zone that athletes, dancers, musicians, and even meditators find themselves in when the task they're performing becomes effortless, time slows down, analysis goes quiet, and intuition guides each decision. And though these flow states can be brought on simply through mental discipline or breathing techniques, another reliable way is through microdosing psychedelic plants.
Many of the medical benefits of cannabis are attributed to CBD. And while CBD does relieve certain negative symptoms, what scientists are now discovering is that another characteristic of cannabis also contributes to the healing properties of this plant. This characteristic is called the entourage effect, a phenomenon where the multitude of compounds inside of cannabis synergistically work together to create a healing effect throughout the body. In other words, it's the sum of its parts that makes cannabis so effective. Now, as mentioned, the other most common cannabinoid is THC, which stands for tetrahydrocannabinol. This is the chemical responsible for most of the easily noticeable effects of cannabis, including that euphoric high. THC resembles another cannabinoid which is naturally produced in our bodies called anandamide, which regulates mood, sleep, memory, and appetite. THC and anandamide bind to the receptors in our brains. In the natural sense, once the receptors in our brains fire, they take a rest before firing again. But when THC binds to our neural receptors, it allows our neurons to turn on and remain that way for usually between 2 to 8 hours, depending on the method of ingestion. The most common way of consuming cannabis is by smoking it. However, it is often vaporized or made into edible treats. The benefit that people like about this neuronic effect is that it opens up your ability to think very expansive and deep thoughts. This can bring about epiphanies, moving experiences, and ultimately a magnification of whatever is going on within and around you as it's happening in real time. The experience is also affected by the type of cannabis that you consume, sativa or indica. Sativas are grown in tropical climates, are very tall, and have thinner leaves. These plants generally have more THC content, giving you a cerebral head buzz, more alertness, and creative flow. Indicas, on the other hand, are grown in subtropical climates, are not as tall, and have wider leaves. These plants generally have a higher CBD ratio and provide you with help relaxing your muscles, aiding in pain relief, and all around reducing stress. But it's not all sunshines and rainbows, because in large quantities, cannabis can affect one's psyche negatively. Cannabis has been known to affect memory in the brain and can also make you potentially more lazy, especially when used in large quantities. Further, you may on occasion find yourself magnifying into something that's uncomfortable or strange, and this can cause you to feel paranoia, anxiety, and potentially nausea. Cannabis does not make you go insane, but, well, Kurzgesagt explains it really well.
A study from Britain found that while marijuana use has risen significantly between 1996 and 2005, the number of schizophrenia cases, a type of psychosis, remained stable. The risk of marijuana-induced psychosis remains the highest for people who already have a high risk of psychosis to begin with. For them, it seems more likely that marijuana speeds up the development of their condition rather than causing it, as far as we know right now.
To go back to what Alan Lightman said in the beginning about measurement and experience, I believe that this concept directly applies here as well. See, you can actively measure what happens in the brain and body when high on cannabis, and yet the quantitative data won't really come close to describing the qualitative experience. Further, the experience elicited from cannabis will be affected by the setting in which it's ingested and the intention of why a person is ingesting it to begin with. When using cannabis with the intention of having a transcendent experience, we can effectively use cannabis to facilitate states of higher cognitive function, deeper understanding, spiritual development, and a more open connection with others. Remember though, simply smoking cannabis does not necessarily cause one to have a transcendent experience. Instead, your consciousness has to direct the focus and let go in order for this to occur. Let me be very clear though, cannabis is not a requirement in order to have a transcendent experience. It's simply one of a multitude of ways by which this can happen. The best way to use cannabis in this way is to combine it with meditation, yoga, or being in nature. Intention is one of the biggest things that I believe can help us bridge the gap between science and spiritual or transcendent experiences. Because these cosmic experiences we have in life are essentially exclusive to us. We can share what we've learned and evolve our personalities and values from these experiences, but that's what they are, personal experiences. Sure, we can measure the brain scans with graphs and charts, but we personally measure them by how meaningful they were to us inside.
Cannabis is much more, in my opinion, about sensual experience, about realizing the full potential of our sensuality. And when I say sensuality, I don't only mean sex. I'm also talking about appreciation of food, appreciation of music, stuff that our ears and our eyes have been shut off to. Suddenly it comes in and we realize what majesty we live amongst.
The World Drug Report in 2014 said that cannabis is on average used by 1 in 7 Americans regularly. As cannabis becomes more and more available and socially acceptable in the world, it's up to all of us to be mindful and practice responsible use.
Daniel McQueen founded Medicinal Mindfulness, which specializes in the spiritual and therapeutic application of psychedelics or breathing techniques in the Boulder, Colorado area.
Well, in regards to set and setting with cannabis, we bring in a gratitude prayer when we imbibe the medicine, and we sit in a circle, and we're calling in energies and ways of being that support psychedelic journey work. And this is far from like the exact opposite extreme of recreational use or unconscious use or habitual use. You know, we're not just sitting there feeling stoned or blissed out, that there's some real significant psychological, spiritual, and energetically healing and life-transforming occurrences happening in the psyche and in the body. And we turn towards those experiences instead of using the medicine to check out from those experiences.
By creating a healing intention or a safe space to enter deeply mystical realms, circles such as these are dismantling the negative stereotypes and calling in a revival of ancient ceremonial use of this plant.
We can consider that example as one of the higher levels of what cannabis can be used for. But let's be real. There is a wide variety of ways that humanity does things here on Earth, and cannabis culture also has some bigger concerns we have to face. One of the biggest discussions is actually about how it affects kids, one of the largest groups of people smoking cannabis today. As we know, cannabis affects memory and learning. So how does this affect developing brains? Researchers in this field are finding that younger people should be careful and mindful about cannabis. Long-term characteristics of heavy cannabis use include finding it harder to learn and remember new information. It can also lead to a reduced ability to focus one's attention, be organized, and make decisions. Cannabis can also lead to a loss of motivation, which is where that stoner stereotype comes from. These effects can become more permanent if heavy cannabis use takes place while the brain is still developing. There is also a lot of concern in society about cannabis as it relates to poverty and addiction. Now, the good news about the conversation is that cannabis itself is not the cause of poverty or addiction, but the downside here is that it does have the potential to be treated as an addictive drug, and there are people who use it this way. This can create a dependence if we don't regulate our use. I think the biggest lesson here is that we need to learn to take care of each other and solve the core reasons for poverty and addiction in the first place, which has to do with our connection to each other and building societal systems to make life better for everyone. Speaking of which, there's another aspect of cannabis that simply must be addressed.
And if recreational marijuana is ever to be a truly guilt-free pleasure, we need to rectify our nation's pot laws and do right by those whose lives were ruined by draconian war on drugs sentencing.
Moving forward through the darker side of cannabis, earlier we mentioned that paranoia and anxiety is an aspect of cannabis. Though we should be clear that it's not really the plant's fault. Cannabis magnifies something within or around you that causes you to experience these uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. So the environment and your own inner well-being also play a part in your cannabis experience. Further, the quantity and quality of cannabis that you consume will also affect the experience that you have. On the topic of quality, there is another aspect of cannabis that we need to be aware of, which is something that happened in Colorado when they legalized cannabis.
In fact, I was recently talking to a buddy who had just left a job at a commercial grow operation because he was so concerned with the chemicals that he was being asked to interact with. Some of his fellow employees were actually encouraged to wear hazmat suits while they were spraying their chemical cocktails on the plants. With that kind of manipulation, the products that are being sold today can contain above 30% THC. And our concentrates can actually contain above 95% THC, a far cry from the natural plant. If you've ever set foot inside one of the thousands of dispensaries that have sprung up in recent years, you know that what we're really selling in them is THC. All of the weed that you buy commercially lists exactly how much THC it contains, as do our other much more popular products like vape pens, coffee, ice cream, condiments, granola, gum, candy, baked goods, suppositories. Pretty much anything that you can imagine introducing into the human body. The vast majority of cannabis that's being sold today, it isn't really cannabis. It's THC in either a pure form or in an extremely high and unnatural concentration. To say that we have legalized weed is subtly misleading. We have commercialized THC.
Remember, in order to truly get all of the benefits of cannabis, you need the entire entourage effect, not just one cannabinoid, no matter how high it gets you. Further, the use of pesticides while growing cannabis, and all of our food really, is a problem. You probably don't want to be smoking those chemicals. If you don't know specifically where and how your cannabis is grown, it's probably recommended that you grow your own. Hey, then you could even trade your buds with your buds. Huh, kind of as if they were Pokemon. Ultimately, the legalization of cannabis in Canada is only the beginning of a huge global conversation about consciousness, mind, and reality. We know very well the damaging effects of substances like heroin and meth, and now we are starting to realize that not all methods of altering one's perception has to be scary if we're willing to take the time to understand them, address the risk, and use them properly. If we can learn to use the plants of the earth with love and to the benefit of mankind, they will continue to support us in our conscious evolution. Psychedelics are quickly growing in public curiosity as millions discover their value in healing personal traumas, creative problem solving, and transforming awareness in powerful and often mysterious ways. Some even believe they may be a gateway into different dimensions, where others suggest they promise the key to our collective healing as a whole. But the question is, what are they really? Today, we intend to find out. Joining us to really break it down is none other than Dr. Rick Strassman. 30 years ago, Rick was the first North American physician scientist since the 60s to perform scientific studies on psychedelics. During his trials, he administered approximately 400 doses of DMT to nearly 6 volunteers. His work set the stage for the psychedelic revolution sweeping North America, and today, he is here to share the magical wisdom that he's learned with all of us.
Hi, everyone. Wow, it's a good-looking crowd. Okay, in order to understand psychedelics, first let's explore our modern understanding of consciousness. There are several approaches available, but 2 models useful for our purposes are Freudian and Buddhist psychology. Freud taught that there are 3 mental locations for ideas, memories, and feelings. One is the conscious. We access this information easily, and working with it occupies much of our day. We are conscious of these things, aware of them. The preconscious, sometimes called the subconscious, contains things available only after a little effort. We deal with the preconscious when we try to remember, for example, the name of something. It's at the tip of my tongue, and it comes to mind a moment later. Then there is the unconscious, memories and feelings which, no matter how hard we try, are simply out of our reach. Unconscious mental content influences our behavior and feelings, and by extension, our perceptions and experiences. We know the unconscious exists by its effects on us. It's not uncommon for us to do, say, or feel things we know aren't good or true, but still cannot change. The source of these inner conflicts and how they play out in our lives can only be guessed at. Dreams, Freud taught, provide hints as to what is buried in the unconscious, and that's why dreams are important in deep psychotherapy. Buddhist psychology can also really help us understand how psychedelics work. This ancient system teaches that consciousness consists of a handful of mental functions, functions which become clear through the practice of meditation. These are thinking, feeling, perceiving sensations, the body, and our habits. The end result of these separate functions working together is the sense of someone being conscious. This could be everyday normal waking consciousness, or some altered state brought on by meditation, psychedelics, dreams, near-death experiences, and so on.
Alexander Shulgin was the father of modern psychedelic pharmacology, how the chemical structure of psychedelic substances alter our minds. When lecturing, he illustrated the different kinds of psychoactive compounds with these symbols: an up arrow, a down arrow, and a star. The up arrows are the stimulants. They give us more energy and focus, like your morning coffee, and they affect only 1 or 2 of the mental functions we've just talked about. This narrow range of effects may help us to resolve some psychological issues or provide new insights by making, say, things in the preconscious easier to remember. But their limited benefit is outweighed by their medical and psychological side effects. The down arrow, on the other hand, makes you relaxed, sleepy, and slows your thoughts, and are known as depressants. Think alcohol, the most popular of these sedating substances. Like the stimulants, they affect only 1 or 2 mental functions, and while they likewise might help, for example, thin the barrier to the unconscious, side effects like abuse and addiction cause a lot of problems which are all too common. Now, the stars, on the other hand, are the psychedelics and change every mental mechanism, especially perception, thought, and emotions. Maybe because of their sweeping effects on our psyche, they are also the most helpful in gaining greater self-knowledge, as well as making it easier to put into practice new ways of living our lives.
You'll notice we are using the term psychedelic rather than entheogen, or even plant medicine. Psychedelic has going for it the fact that it is neutral. Psychedelic means mind manifesting or mind disclosing. The name doesn't imply any goals, or good or bad effects. More to the point, psychedelics manifest or disclose what exists in your mind. Only you can have this exact experience because of who you are, exactly. Your life experiences and education, your emotional and physical condition, your beliefs, hopes, and fears. But what about the name entheogen? Well, it assumes a lot, and this limits its appeal and universality, meaning generating the divine or God within. Entheogen assumes that there is a God or a spiritual force or forces. But not everyone believes this, and a spiritual experience may not be what they're looking for. Say, in the case of a hardcore atheist, who, by the way, still might benefit from or even enjoy a psychedelic experience. Entheogen also implies that those spiritual forces, or even God, exists within us, that the information or the source of that knowledge is generated from and resides within us. But many people believe such knowledge comes from an outside force, a God who is separate from us. And while we can approach God, we never become identical with God. So someone with these beliefs may shy away from ingesting an entheogen, who likewise might also benefit from a psychedelic experience, because it's not part of their fundamental worldview. And if the goal of taking an entheogen is to have a spiritual experience, what happens when we don't? Is that our failure, a failure of the entheogen, or a failure of the beliefs attached to the term? As far as the term plant medicine is concerned, this is particularly useful for us today, and it falls in between entheogen and psychedelic on the neutrality scale. These are plants that may include psychoactive compounds. This term may be an important one for the adoption and recognition of the healing benefits of psychedelics found in or derived from plants, specifically when performed with the proper intention, set, and setting for beneficial medicinal purposes. In the psychedelic experience, our senses are magnified in a supernormal way. We may leave behind our bodies, with our minds now free to wander further inward or outward than ever before. We feel powerful emotions, joy and sorrow, ecstasy or terror. We may merge or unite with all of existence, and time and space disappear. Or we may see and communicate with the usually invisible, seemingly spiritual beings who share their knowledge with us, help us, or even heal us.
Psychedelics are chemicals that have strong subjective effects which alter one's perception of reality and sense of self. They work by altering what our neurotransmitters send out or receive, specifically our serotonin system. The most important receptor for psychedelics in the brain is the type called the 2A. This receptor marks an important distinction point when comparing classical psychedelics to compounds which offer some similar subjective effects. A compound like MDMA acts by allowing our brains to be flooded with large amounts of our natural serotonin and activates many different types of serotonin receptors. Classical psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, and DMT, responsible for more otherworldly experiences, supply our serotonin 2A receptors with something a bit different from normal serotonin, just similar enough to fit. But to what degree the effects of psychedelics come from the unique nature of these serotonin-like chemicals interacting with our 2A receptors, or simply how the brain reacts to having just 2A receptors stimulated and not the other ones, is still a question scientists are trying to answer. Attachment of a psychedelic to this receptor triggers a sequence of electrical and chemical events within that nerve cell. In addition, psychedelics promote nerve cell growth and connections among cells, what's called neuroplasticity. So these better connected nerve cells may fire more or less frequently after the psychedelic binds to them. The information encoded in these patterns of activity now spreads to countless nearby neurons, eventually affecting entire brain centers. To that end, dense concentrations of the necessary 2A receptors occur right where you would expect them to be, part of the cerebral cortex linked to thought and vision, hippocampus for memory retrieval, and the limbic system, the emotional brain. Another circuit worth mentioning is the default mode network, which relates to who we are, our sense of self, what we believe and feel, and how we interact with the inner and outer worlds. Psychedelics cause the DMN to function more randomly, in a less rigid manner, and this is felt as a loosening of the self's bonds, its ideas, beliefs, and habitual emotional and behavioral reactions. At the same time, the DMN becomes more responsive to new information. Now our self sees ideas and feelings in a new light, attaches greater or less meaning to them than before because of the DMN's greater sensitivity to input. Alternative opinions and assumptions may make more sense, and change feels more likely, if not inevitable. Things about us and the world become truer than before and easier to act on. These effects of psychedelics, of course, are apparent to anyone who observes their own psychedelic experiences. Yet for some of us, it's satisfying to have scientific confirmation of what we already know from our own experiences. Now, all of this becomes especially valuable when we discuss the factors that make up what you actually undergo during your trip: set, setting, and substance. Set is our makeup, who we are at the moment, physical, mental, spiritual, and even nutritional. It also includes our education, beliefs, past experiences, along with our preparation and goals for this particular session or journey. What do we want and why? Now, setting is the physical environment, laboratory, nature, or a city, for example. It is also our social environment, such as being alone with others. Setting also includes the set of the people around you. Are they supportive or critical, friends or strangers? Are they depressed or angry, or happy and lighthearted? And are they under the influence of any psychoactive substances themselves?
We've learned so much over many decades about the critical role of set and setting. We can align these factors so as to make positive outcomes more common and reduce negative ones. Given the right set and setting, research shows that psychedelics may reduce depression, substance abuse and alcoholism, disordered eating, domestic violence, the risk of former prisoners returning to prison, antisocial and borderline personality disorders, and OCD. From the wellness perspective, they may increase creativity, spiritual growth, meditative power, and appreciation of music and nature. Finally, besides the all-important set and setting, the subject of substance is not just what kind of psychedelic you take, but also there's the matter of dose. This could include enough for a full-blown trip, or a microdose. Microdoses may be so small that they have no effect at all, but if taken daily for some weeks may produce subtle yet meaningful changes. A slightly higher dose may produce effects like the up arrow substances: sharper focus, more energy, and elevated mood. Slightly higher doses yet, while not fully psychedelic, indicate to us where we might be heading.
Research today is finding that psychedelics can support us in achieving certain psychological and spiritual goals when taken in the right circumstances, along with facilitating both mental and physical healing. If psychedelics can rearrange our psyche into greater health, so might the body follow suit. This could be especially true for those disorders where psychological factors play a significant role. asthma, irritable bowel syndrome, pain, autoimmune diseases, and more. It's for this reason that it's so important that if we're venturing into the psychedelic universe, we do so with the right setting, and substance. And this is exactly the reason why we've collaborated with Rick inside of Spirit Mysteries with Spirit Medicine Walkers. This is a full-blown 30-hour masterclass that we've created to provide you with the ultimate psychedelic knowledge to guarantee you have a powerful and healing journey. Along with a special Q&A with Rick, we also have an exclusive interview with a rhythmia shaman and explore thoroughly setting up and navigating ceremony, among many other things. Continuing down our rabbit hole of psychedelics, today it's time to discuss what many people call the spirit molecule. Known as DMT, it is short for N,N-dimethyltryptamine. While fewer of us may have heard of this psychedelic than the more popular psilocybin, LSD, or ayahuasca, DMT is very peculiar. You see, it exists throughout the natural world, including in hundreds, if not thousands of plants. It also appears in every mammal that's been studied, including us. So DMT, unlike psilocybin and LSD, exists naturally in the human body. It is endogenous, which means made within the body. This happens when dietary tryptophan is converted into tryptamine using an enzyme called AADC. Then another enzyme called IMNT attaches two methyl groups to the tryptamine, and voila, dimethyltryptamine. And the rapid spread of this botanical psychedelic in the Western world is introducing the DMT experience to a vast, widespread audience. Well, that and Joe Rogan won't stop talking about it. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, DMT ushered in the North American psychedelic renaissance. DMT is usually smoked. However, during his experiments, Dr. Strassman injected DMT intravenously to ensure that subjects received the whole dose without coughing and to avoid any lung problems. The IV route was just as fast and intense as the smoked one. In both cases, effects begin within a few heartbeats, peak at about 2 minutes, and start to fade at about 10 to 12 minutes. A DMT experience might go something like this. Generally, the first thing you notice is a sense of inner excitement, tension, anticipation, and acceleration. The visual world begins to break up into a pixelated structure, and with eyes closed, you might see a rapid morphing, buzzing, intensely colored display of geometric patterns. There's a high-pitched sound that rises in intensity until a climax is reached. Your body now disappears, falls away as you enter into a world of light. The geometric patterns now coalesce, becoming more solid, and you can identify shapes and objects that are more brilliantly saturated and bright than you've ever seen before. Here you are absolutely transfixed by this new world, your mind enveloped in a space with no borders, powerful, pulsating with energy, absolutely convincing. More real than real, your mind and what it is beholding are made of the same stuff. Not that you and it are the same, but your mind occupies the same level of reality as does the display playing out all around you. It is a state full of information and significance. Oftentimes, beings appear, insects, plants, angelic or robotic creatures. They relate to you and you to them. They may comfort, frighten, heal, or teach. They are as aware of you as you are of them. The experience feels outside of time, but still there is a progression, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Vast amounts of experience occur in real time, tiny time scales. And almost as quickly as you enter the state, you exit it. And in the case of the Albuquerque volunteers, you're talking normally and sipping tea by 30 to 45 minutes after the injection. So, what exactly is DMT?
Like all other psychedelics, DMT is a chemical, a molecule, not much larger in molecular weight than blood sugar or glucose. It is also the simplest of the tryptamine psychedelics. The tryptamines are one of the two major families of classical psychedelics. 5-methoxy-DMT and bufo toad venom, psilocybin, and LSD are also tryptamines. The other family is the phenethylamines. The most well-known is mescaline from peyote cactus. DMT psychopharmacology, in other words its effects on brain chemistry, receptors, and related circuits, is nearly identical to the other classical psychedelics, attaching to serotonin 2A receptors on nerve cells in brain areas regulating perception, emotion, thought, and so on. DMT, however, is unique in that tolerance does not develop with repeated administration. Normally, the same dose of a drug given repeatedly results in a decrease of effect over time. However, giving DMT twice a day in humans, in a study from the 1970s, resulted in no change in tolerance. While you might think it was the short duration of DMT's effects behind these results, a study in cats reported no tolerance, even at a dosing schedule of every 2 hours for 21 consecutive days. Even in our studies, we tried to cause tolerance by giving a full dose every half hour 4 times, but no tolerance to its psychological effects appeared. This lack of tolerance to DMT is important in considering whether it has a role in human consciousness. For example, when scientists began developing a theory of overproduction of DMT in schizophrenia, a lack of tolerance was necessary for this theory. Otherwise, the psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia would last only until tolerance to DMT developed. But we know otherwise, that such symptoms are often constant. The same could be said of any altered state in which endogenous DMT may play a role. Dreams, meditative trance, and near-death experiences. As long as DMT remains elevated, it continues producing an effect rather than tolerance developing.
It's tempting to dismiss claims of how real the bizarre DMT world feels, but this is one of the most characteristic features, one that occurs more often and intensely than with other classical psychedelics. It wasn't until Dr. Strassman decided to accept this claim at face value, engaging in a thought experiment, that his subjects were able to let their guard down enough to describe their most extraordinary encounters. Before that, the models he had brought to his research interpreted these experiences as hallucinatory and unreal. As we explored in our last video, these models were psychopharmacology and psychology, specifically Freudian and Buddhist. In other words, the brain, the unconscious, and meditative enlightenment. The psychopharmacology model says that the DMT effect is just your brain on drugs. I wonder if it looked like an egg frying in a pan. Freudian psychology, that it's just like a dream, symbolizing usually unconscious conflicts and wishes. And Zen Buddhism, which teaches that the DMT world is the miscellaneous and non-essential being shed by the mind on your way towards the true goal, a formless, unified state of emptiness. All three imply that the DMT world is something else, which is the complete opposite of the experience itself, one that feels more real than anything you've ever seen before. If the contents of the DMT state are real, where might they be? Inside of us or outside of us? Is the experience revealed or produced? Wherever it is, its contents were previously invisible and now are visible. In favor of the idea that the contents of the DMT world are outside of us, one volunteer put it this way: "I couldn't have imagined this." Another said, "It's not a drug, it's a technology. Like a microscope revealing a freestanding, objective, but utterly alien world existing all around us."
Modern physics points to possible locations for these normally invisible but real layers of the universe. One scenario is that DMT changes the receiving ability of the mind-brain complex, allowing us to perceive dark matter. Most of the universe's matter is dark, neither reflecting nor generating light. Perhaps the world of dark matter is also inhabited, and what we see in the DMT space exists there. While such a theory crosses the line separating science and science fiction, it may direct future research projects dealing with this question. For example, in the future, we may have sensors that can image the contents of dark matter. Then we could compare reports from DMT volunteers with those images. Regardless of the location of the DMT world, inner, outer, or most likely some combination, it is not only the things that we see and hear there, but the information that we bring back from visiting it. What did we learn? What's different now? Like the effects of all psychedelics, who we are and what our goals are, what we bring to our sessions, determine the value of the experience, no matter how unusual it may be. While we now understand a lot about how the brain makes DMT, we still don't know what regulates its production, what triggers an increase in its formation, and what inhibits it. Concentrations of DMT in the blood and urine are too low to measure. However, now that we can monitor the activity of the genes controlling DMT production, future research can measure that activity. For example, is the DMT system in people with schizophrenia more active than healthy controls? For many years, high concentrations of INMT in the lungs led us to believe that this was the primary source of DMT in the body. Some people even said, tongue-in-cheek, that schizophrenia was a lung disease. But in the end, they couldn't find the AADC enzyme there. Likewise, since NDEs, dreams, or deep states of meditation have their own DMT-like features, then such features in similar sober states, visions, voices, loss of body awareness, meeting beings, and the supernormal sense of reality, might be driven in part by changes in endogenous DMT. Interestingly, the brain makes more DMT at the moment of death. In fact, DMT is neuroprotective in conditions of low oxygen, which gives us a working model for NDEs. In addition, the greatest elevation of DMT in dying animals occurs in the visual cortex.
But just as much as DMT may be involved in non-drug altered states, it also may play a part in normal waking states too. Research from the University of Michigan reported that concentrations of brain DMT in normal conditions are as high as those for well-known neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. This suggests that DMT may be a neurotransmitter present in the brain, although a couple of other questions remain unanswered. One of the ways we learn about the functions of a neurotransmitter is by looking at the effects of substances that affect it. For dopamine, we know from cocaine and methamphetamines that it mediates pleasure and reward. In the case of serotonin, its importance in mood regulation is clear from the effects of SSRI antidepressants. In addition, psychedelics' effects on perception and sense of self point to a role for serotonin in these functions too. You see, one of DMT's most characteristic effects is altering our sense of reality. It provides a feeling of beholding something more real than real, unshakably true, and makes everyday reality seem like a pale, flat imitation. The DMT world completely replaces this one. In the 1990s, Dr. Strassman theorized DMT was produced in the pineal gland, and 20 years later, the University of Michigan found the pineal to be one such organ that had the necessary tissues to do so.
A possible DMT neurotransmitter system may regulate our sense of what is real, a reality thermostat, so to speak, requiring the maintenance of a normal range of brain levels to maintain normal everyday reality. When the activity of this system is high, whatever is in our mind, experiences, feelings, and thoughts, takes on a greater sense of reality. It is true for us, valuable, and adds solidity to who we are, our beliefs, and our behavior. Or, when the activity of this hypothetical system is low, we correspondingly don't think much about whatever it is in our mind at that time, and it has little lasting impact on us. Now this leads us down a very murky rabbit hole with many twists and turns. What does it mean that the brain produces a substance that may regulate our sense of reality? Does that mean our sense of reality is dependent on levels of that substance? Or even constructed by it? I've even theorized that DMT may be the endomatrix, regulating consensus reality by some internal biological process. But what controls that biological process? While DMT continues to occupy the periphery of the academic research community, the larger psychedelic world is well aware of and well versed in its properties. There are at least two reasons why scientific inquiry lags behind public interest. First, the DMT experience is very strange, unlike anything one has previously experienced, even with other psychedelics. How can you describe it and fit it into mainstream reality? Can it even be contained within this reality? Second, endogenous DMT, including a possible DMT neurotransmitter system, raises incredibly complex issues about the self and the outside world. In other words, what is real and what is not.
As you know, we've often sought to explore the split worlds of science and spirit, and DMT appears to straddle both. A physical molecule that reveals to us a seemingly spiritual world, functioning as a spirit molecule. Because of this, DMT requires much more study and a global enlarging discussion about psychedelics. We are just at the beginning of understanding this fascinating and unique substance, and thank heavens, because it's just so long overdue. Buckle your seatbelts, this is still only the tip of the iceberg. The effects of psychedelics can be difficult to understand and apply, which is why models are so helpful. Just as biological models help explain what's happening inside the brain, models for subjective experience, what we are conscious of, also provide a valuable platform for exploration. We can approach the subjective psychedelic state, what it feels like when we are tripping, from either a spiritual or a psychological perspective, and we find that the two definitely overlap. However, since today we're talking about the spiritual properties of psychedelics, we're going to continue focusing on this avenue for now.
The hallmark of a major psychedelic experience, especially DMT, is the sense that what you are seeing, thinking, and feeling is more real than real, more true, intense, relevant, and convincing than anything you've ever experienced before. This is why spiritual traditions are helpful. They believe these experiences are real, which is why they are so important to the traditions. In contrast, materialistic, reductionistic, scientific explanations, either psychological or biological, treat the content of spiritual experiences as unreal. They are something else, alterations in brain function or uncovering unconscious material. Another strength of time-tested religious traditions is their emphasis on meaning and integration of spiritual experiences. How do we learn the most we can from these elevated states? What are the take-home lessons? How do we put them into practice? The millennia-old accumulated wisdom of religious models helps us address these questions. We don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we have a psychedelic experience, nor do we have to return to the psychedelic state every time we need answers. Once we have found a spiritual system that works for us, we can find answers in our normal state of consciousness, consulting texts, teachers, or community.
As far as spiritual models go, there are indigenous models, especially shamanism, which has the advantage of accepting the reality of the contents of the visions, including the spirit guides who frequently appear and play such an important role in healing and teaching. Eastern religions are another popular model here. Just look at one of the most popular early psychedelic handbooks that modeled itself after a centuries-old Buddhist text. The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Currently, there's one particular spiritual model that hasn't been associated or discussed in relationship to the psychedelic experience, at least not very often, in fact, very scarcely. And those would be the Western traditions, especially that we call Judeo-Christian. Many of us have rejected these religions, let alone even considered them in the first place as playing a role in our spiritual lives. This is usually because of how we perceive them being misused by unscrupulous people in order to gain power, fame, and wealth. Even worse are those who commit terrible acts justifying themselves through distorted readings of the Bible. Add to this our childhood experiences with these religions. No one answered our questions about the strange language and stories, laws, poetry, and wisdom. But now, as psychedelics bring us deeper into spiritual matters, how many of us as adults have actually looked carefully into what these traditions teach?
The spiritual basis of both Judaism and Christianity is the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament. And in my own research, I found that Hebrew Bible prophecy is an attractive alternative model to Eastern religious or nature-based shamanic ones for understanding and integrating our psychedelic experiences. The Hebrew Bible is a collection of 24 books, some dating back thousands of years. Most people today don't realize that the Hebrew Bible underlies most of Western civilization, including theology, politics, economics, ethics and morality, philosophy, law, and ritual. Many of our most common names today are biblical: Daniel and Isaac, Sarah and Ruth. Today, 1/2 of the world's population considers the Hebrew Bible its foundational spiritual text, clearly making it a powerful and enduring collection of books. This is because the Hebrew Bible is a prophetic text, one that brings us closer to the power and timelessness of the prophetic experience. Why should we exclude ourselves from tapping its resources, especially if it can help us with our psychedelic journeys? Now, as we are entering the Hebrew Bible, please keep in mind that all translation is interpretation. There are many subtle differences in how translations treat specific words, and this affects the overall meaning of the text. For example, be fruitful and multiply can be translated as a command or as a prediction. You will be fruitful and multiply. While learning biblical Hebrew is beyond most of us, there are many good English translations. And since the Hebrew Bible is Jewish scripture, it makes sense to utilize a Jewish translation.
What to read, however, is just the beginning. But how do we read it? We recommend a literal reading, not what it might be referring to, say Jesus or psychedelic plants, but what is the text actually saying? Many misconceptions can be dealt with very quickly using this method. We can do this by assuming the universe of the Hebrew Bible is as real, or more so, than this universe and see where that leads us. Here's an example. It appears that God angrily expelled Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden because they ate from the tree of knowledge. Whatever that fruit was, some even think it was a psychedelic plant, a common interpretation is that God wanted humans to stay ignorant. However, it is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What's wrong with that, you might ask? Reading the story carefully, however, we learn that before eating the fruit, Adam and Eve were not ashamed of being naked, and afterwards they were, and tried hiding from God. Before, they lived in a world of truth, what's true and what's false. Now they live in a world of subjectivity, opinions, emotion-driven conclusions and actions, good or bad. No longer what's true and what's false. In other words, they devolved and are no longer fit inhabitants of paradise. Once we ground ourselves in a plain reading of the text, we can search for its fundamental teachings, such as how to relate to the spiritual world and how to relate to the material one. In the first case, it is that there exists one God who created and sustains existence. The second, relationship with the material world, is the golden rule: love your fellow as yourself. Applying Buddhist ideas to these concepts may make them easier to understand. This system says that all existence is karmic, the result of cause and effect. Things are now because of what came before. Understanding God as the creator and sustainer of cause and effect provides a foothold for accepting God's existence and activities. And the golden rule is a good example of the workings of reward and punishment, which is another way of expressing cause and effect. Certain behavior leads to certain consequences. Loving your fellow leads to positive consequences, while hating him or her leads to negative ones.
Getting back to prophecy. Most of us think of prophecy as predicting the future, but this is only one small aspect of the larger phenomenon. That larger phenomenon is any spiritual experience had by any figure in the text. These range from Moses on Mount Sinai to a nameless foot soldier accurately dreaming the outcome of a battle. In chapter 1 of Ezekiel, the prophet hears an overwhelming roar, falls on his face. The heavens open, and he sees beings with wings, with eyes on their wings. They move to and fro in ways he can't understand. An ice blue heavenly canopy, flashing lightning, spinning wheels and spheres fill Ezekiel's visual field. An angel grabs him by the hair, lifting him heavenward, and begins speaking to him. Son of man. Does this sound familiar? This could just as well be a description of a modern-day DMT experience. The Hebrew Bible turns out to have an astonishing degree of overlap between the DMT effect and prophetic experience. However, the two states differ in one very important way. The prophetic experience is cognitive. It contains verbal information, is filled with words spoken to the prophet by God or angels, and prophetic figures have a box full of verbal and cognitive tools helping them recognize what they see and how to initiate and carry on dialogue with God or angels. Just as important, they know how to communicate the prophetic message verbally to others.
Today, the reigning scientific approach to spiritual experience is neurotheology, a bottom-up model. Certain stimuli, including psychedelics, prayer, and meditation, activate a brain reflex that results in an altered state of consciousness that we later label spiritual. It's your brain on drugs, or prayer, or meditation. The brain generates the impression of communicating with God. Rick's work with the soul of prophecy, however, suggests that the Hebrew Bible's prophetic model lets us propose a top-down alternative, Theo-neurology. Here, God designed the brain in order to communicate with us. DMT is made in the brain, and administering DMT produces effects similar to those described by the prophets. Let's then suggest that God communicates with us through producing visions that have their basis in elevated endogenous DMT. And the information the visions contain is determined by their source, an external divine being. While many seek for references to psychedelics in the Bible, the presence of endogenous DMT makes this unnecessary, and the text provides no evidence for the use of any intoxicant other than wine. Although some do suggest that there are hints or subtle references for some kind of psychedelics here and there, though that is not as definitive as we would like it to be.
Once the prophet receives his or her visions, they must extract information from them. This requires a different part of the mind than where the visions and voices reside. This is the intellect, the rational function, our thinking faculties that deal with ideas, concepts, and words. So while DMT may mediate what we see, hear, and feel, it is the intellect, the thinking part of our mind, that must decipher what they mean. This is why study of the prophetic text is so important. If we recognize what we're seeing, possess a vocabulary and communication skills aiding our ability to relate with the beings, we are much further ahead than simply witnessing a train of images that confuse and baffle us. The Hebrew Bible is a prophetic text, just like Buddhist sutras are meditative texts. The Hebrew Bible is a record of prophetic experience, and just as studying sutras causes the mind to resonate with the mind of meditation, so does study of the Hebrew Bible cause our mind to resonate with that of prophecy, the source of the text. Even more intriguing is this idea. If psychedelics mimic elements of the prophetic experience, combining text study with psychedelic work may take us even further into prophecy-like realms. This is where our familiarity with the Hebrew Bible lessens the risk of false prophecy, keeps us grounded with its teachings and moral guidelines. It's not something we make up as we go along. Rather, we are stepping into a vast and powerful, deep and wide, thousands-of-year-old tradition that supports and guides us, both in the psychedelic state and afterwards. It's not an easy tradition to enter, however, and requires dedication and working with trained teachers, text study, and like-minded peers, just like Buddhism or shamanism.
Thank you so much for coming on this journey with us. And please give a round of applause to Rick Strassman for his amazing work over the years and for joining us in these fun psychedelic episodes. Truly, the best way that you can support him and his research is by going and getting his books and spreading the word on his material.
We hope this brief introduction to biblical prophecy and DMT stimulates your curiosity about this way of interpreting and integrating your psychedelic experiences. Good luck.
She stopped and looked outside like it was the first time she's ever seen the world. And then she told me, she said, I just purged out my cancer. And then after she went home, she ended up going to the doctor and, the cancer was gone.
Our story begins thousands of years ago, deep in the Amazon rainforest. The ancient legends say that the first instructions to make the ayahuasca brew came from the plant spirits themselves, who guided the Native American shamans to gather two particular plants together and combine them into a thick brew. Upon drinking this murky concoction, the shaman would then experience a transcendent perception of reality for the next 4 to 8 hours. A heightened level of sensitivity and connection to all things would overtake them, and they would have visions of geometric patterns, spirits, or supernatural formations that would unfold in the mind's eye. In this experience, they would even receive wisdom and guidance from beyond the veil. From here, the shaman would then use this heightened awareness to learn and gain knowledge of the world, and use this to guide their people so that the whole collective could thrive together in their little pocket of early civilization. To many in the world today, the story of ayahuasca's origin may seem rather far-fetched, because for the story to be true, we have to accept both that plants have souls and can communicate with people. Then again, there are over 80,000 species of plants in the Amazon rainforest alone. So how is it that these ancient people came upon such an unlikely combination to produce such a remarkable brew? Today, one of the most incredible mysteries in the world is the unique and mystical experience of ayahuasca. Growing to be known for its powerful role it can play in helping to overcome disease, addiction, depression, and anxiety, it's no wonder that in today's world, which is ever struggling with its varieties of sicknesses, so many are turning to shamanic plant medicines to see if it can be the answer they are looking for. But wait, hold up. We might be getting ahead of ourselves here. What exactly is this ayahuasca stuff anyways? Let's start with the basics. Ayahuasca is a brew, like a thick soupy drink created primarily from two plants, the leaves of the Psychotria viridis and the vine of the Banisteriopsis cappi. The psychotria plant contains a large amount of DMT, a molecule produced by our brains in small amounts when we're dreaming, and in larger amounts both when we're born and when we die. This molecule is also found in nature, but generally has no effect on the human body when consumed. This is because our body breaks down the molecule with an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, commonly called an MAO. However, the vine of the kappi plant contains an MAO inhibitor, which allows the DMT of the psychotria plant to pass through the stomach and into our bloodstream. When it reaches the brain, it causes an activation of the pineal gland, producing a state like lucid dreaming, except you don't have to be asleep in the slightest. This is, in a nutshell, the essential science behind what's happening with these ayahuasca journeys. However, the actual experience itself is something else entirely to behold. Ayahuasca is often described as a concentrated dose of nature, designed to help us reconnect with ourselves and the natural world. It illuminates one's consciousness, aiding any seeker to look deeper into themselves at the source of their trauma, disease, and pain, and helps them in healing these ailments from its source. From this state, we also then learn to perceive reality at deeper, more fundamental levels, and ayahuasca even helps in letting go of the personal identification with modern cultural and social systems in which so many of us have become trapped. It is for this reason that ayahuasca, along with its brother and sister plant medicines such as iboga and peyote, have become known today as sacred plant medicines, as well as great teacher plants. While many modern medicines today treat illnesses, depression, and the like on a symptom-based level, these master plants go deeper and allow anyone to dive to the root of their challenges and solve them for good. Illness, addiction, depression, and the like all fade away when our consciousness is illuminated, shining bright on the subconscious ego that is damaging us without even knowing it. What I personally find especially remarkable about ayahuasca is that once you experience it, the concept of the human soul, your own spirit, becomes very conceivable and directly experienceable. And it opens up a space of curiosity within you to try and understand it deeper. Of course, it's critical to note that this experience of ayahuasca only comes out when there is an intention to match it. For anyone who is familiar with the medicine today, it is well understood that these experiences are to be treated as sacred and with great reverence. It's very important to use it properly because ayahuasca opens us up to a dream state of connection with the world. And without the supportive energy of a shaman, it's very possible to become lost in the journey, which could even be damaging to the psyche. This is not to suggest that ayahuasca is inherently dangerous. No more than a hammer can be used to either build a house or smash a window. But truly, this medicine helps to teach us to understand that intention steers the reality you experience. Going into an ayahuasca journey with the intention of creating healing versus going in with the intention of just having a party will yield two very different experiences. Today, with thousands of testimonials of people having tried ayahuasca emerging all over the world, the results seem to demonstrate that this sacred brew can provide us with an experience of self-discovery, spiritual reconnection, and a healing of our hearts, provided that we use it in the right way. To many, the ayahuasca experience sounds too good to be true. A magical plant drink that cures anxiety, disease, addiction, and improves overall quality of life across the board? Is this even possible? In this very movie, we're going to find out. Sit back, relax, and journey with me today to Costa Rica and see for yourself what happens when someone participates in a plant medicine ceremony. Now, when I arrive in Costa Rica, there's going to be so many amazing people to meet, I'm certain of it. But to make things interesting, I've invited my friend John to come along for the ride. We've been friends since we were only 11 years old, and he thought it sounded like a wonderful experience. So before departing, I invited him to the Spirit Science office, and we filmed some preliminary interviews for this adventure.
Well, I've only done mushrooms before, and I've gone camping and done them as a teenager, and also out at the cabin with some friends. We'll do that probably every summer, and then with you, we've done our ceremony before, and I found them to be really fun, and they very mind-opening experience, and they make my mind really wander.
The first psychedelic I actually really took was LSD on 11/11 of 2011. And that opened my eyes to so much more than I was ever really aware of. And it quickly just became like, I was like, okay, I have to try them all now. over the course of the years, I've had, several ceremonies, some with LSD, some with mushrooms, peyote and San Pedro. And it wasn't until rhythmia until I tried ayahuasca. I want to evolve to the highest possible level that I can. Using the ayahuasca journey in this way will really help when I come back to this world and go to make more videos and go to do the work that I do in my daily life. And I really want to be able to take and absorb or learn as much as I possibly can so that I can bring that back to the world. Evolution, I think, is at the forefront of my mind in that regard.
I'm looking for self-reflection and a lot of I'm going at it with an open mind. I'm not quite sure what I'm gonna experience, but I know it'll be something magical, change my perception, come back a different person. Maybe a little bit different, we'll see. I'm sure, mushrooms for the first time, I imagined one thing and it was completely different. So I kind of think this will be the same way. I'll maybe have some imagination, my mind will start to wander and try and figure out what it is. But I imagine once I actually, have the ayahuasca, it'll be a totally different experience than I imagined. So I don't know what to expect, but that's okay. I think that's exciting. Let's go on an adventure.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
The destination of our journey today is a place called Rhythmia. You might have heard of it. It's been growing in popularity the last few years with an endless stream of miraculous healing stories coming out of it. The whole space is beautiful, designed from the ground up and the top down to facilitate a deep, transcendent healing experience for anyone who goes there. Rhythmia features workshops, organic buffets, massages, colonic cleanses, the works. But of course, all of this is designed around these 4 potent ayahuasca ceremonies, each honoring a different tradition from different parts of Central and South America. When we first arrived, we went to the orientation workshop on Monday morning, and it was here that we got to meet Rhythmia's founder, Gerard Powell, though everyone just calls him Jerry. He begins the class with an introduction and tells us the story of Rhythmia. For most of his life, Jerry was a pretty mean guy. He struggled with some really nasty addictions and was cruel to everyone that he knew. There was even a time when he acknowledged his struggles and tried to correct his attitude towards the world. But despite getting help from world-class psychologists, nothing seemed to make a difference. Then everything changed when he was invited to Costa Rica to try a plant medicine called iboga. Iboga is another entheogenic plant medicine native to Central and South America, though it's worth noting that it's a very different experience than ayahuasca. Upon arriving at that retreat, Jerry was filled with doubts about this helping him at all. The shaman had him write down several of the most important questions he'd like to have answered, but even as he wrote them down, thoughts of leaving filled his mind. But before he could get a chance to duck out, his shaman invited him to take the medicine. Jerry looked at the shaman, looked at the medicine, and took it straight away. Then he followed the shaman's instructions to lay down and put on a blindfold. Once he acknowledged he was seeing visions, the shaman sat by his head and began tapping on Jerry's forehead. He spoke in a calm voice. "Jerry man, tell me when you see my finger." Jerry began to respond, "That's ridiculous. I'm wearing a blindfold. How could I possibly see your All of a sudden, he could see the shaman's finger tapping on his head. His hands shot up to his blindfold and was even more amazed to realize that it was still fully there, covering his eyes. I see it," Jerry responded, confused, and the shaman said, "Take a look at the ceiling." Jerry saw the ceiling of the temple through the blindfold, and the shaman commanded him, "Make it disappear." Within moments, Jerry watched as the ceiling vanished, and soon all that he could see were the stars in the night sky. "Pick a star and jump to it," the shaman instructed, and Jerry soon found himself leaving his body, shooting through the sky, flying into outer space. He heard the shaman again, "Can you see the moon?" Jerry turned and saw the moon. "Fly to the moon." Following the shaman's instructions, Jerry shot towards the moon until everything went black. A television screen appeared in his inner vision, one of those really old school TVs. It turned on and he saw two things. One was a text cursor, looking like an old MS-DOS screen. On the other side, he saw an image of the moon with two little feet sticking out of it. They were his feet, he realized, and after flying to the moon, he had actually shot straight into it and got stuck inside. "Hi, Jerry," the cursor typed. This gave him chills, and he soon discovered that he was talking to the spirit of the moon. Jerry learned that the moon could help him understand why he was so cruel, but he'd have to go and find his soul first, and so off he went. His soul appeared as a child version of himself and took adult Jerry on a journey through his past and showed him the roots of his cruelty today. As a young child, Jerry had suffered a horrifying abuse at the hand of a family member. The impact that it had on him was so intense that it disconnected him from the world and himself. This caused his heart to sour and then rot. His soul then guided him to face those responsible for his childhood trauma and to forgive them. This very act set the stage for everything to come because the forgiveness itself liberated Jerry from the pain of his past. After this experience, he was able to return to the moon. As he landed, he saw that the TV was there, along with a pair of hands. His shaman guided him to ask the moon for help. She pointed at his chest, and he knew he had to pull it open, and he pulled out his own heart. It was black and dead. Once again, the shaman guided Jerry to ask the moon for help, and she put her hands together and produced for him a new heart. He put it in his chest and closed it up. The moon typed, "I'll be seeing you, Jerry." And he said, "Okay," flying off back to his body. When he returned to the physical dimension, his shaman pulled off his blindfold and looked at him with a big goofy smile and said, "Happy birthday, man." And so, Jerry received a new heart, and for the first time since he was a boy, genuinely felt love inside. The next morning, he was a changed man, and he found himself acting differently than ever before. Normally, he wouldn't care about anyone around him, but he suddenly found himself talking to the other people at the retreat, learning their stories. He was amazed by the miraculous change that he'd experienced in just one night. Over the next year, Jerry did countless ceremonies. He tried the various shamanic plant medicines from peyote to ayahuasca, and through his experiences, he came to understand who he was and saw the bigger picture of the human story. Jerry was guided by the moon to abandon his existing business plans and to do something meaningful with his life. He would become an instrument of healing and was guided to create a space that would provide the highest quality of healing ceremonies he could and help raise awareness about the value of shamanic plant medicines. The moon told him where he would find the land to do it, what it would be called, and what it would look like. She also said that the best medicine to work with in a group setting would be the ayahuasca brew, and so this became the plant medicine for the space. All of the instructions flooded into his mind, and when he came out of his ceremonies, he went to work. Following the moon's guidance, he sold all of his worldly possessions and poured the resources he had into buying the land and building the place that would one day become the spiritual nexus called rhythmia.
What I love about rhythmia most of all is that it's a fusion, this beautiful fusion of this old shamanic tradition that goes back for thousands of years, fused with a modern, luxurious setting. You get to have the organic all-you-can-eat buffet, the very wonderful accommodations for your room where you sleep in, and then you get to have this very traditional shamanic ayahuasca ceremony that is just, it takes you back, in the majesty of the jungle and everything, just takes you to this place of transcendent beauty and awe. And then when you finally come back, it's like you're not so far removed from the world that you came from. It definitely is a nice balance for anybody who's just sort of wanting to jump in, but maybe isn't quite ready to go as deep as you can into the jungle. And so it's a really good first step in that regard, and I really honor and respect what they've done with that space and that energy. It's absolutely beautiful.
I think was the second question I ever asked the moon, was I asked her, what's the secret to happiness? And she typed out the word truth. And she typed it 1,000 times if she typed it once, all in a nanosecond. And at the end, like down this whole page, the last word was the word authenticity. And I read it and I said to her, I said, well, how do I become more authentic? And she said, stop shining a light on the things that you're not.
Man, it was a ride. I'm still processing all of it. It's like a lot to take in, especially 4 nights in a row of ceremonies. I had been doing a lot of research, and a common thing that you'll read about ayahuasca is people experience their own death. And frankly, like, that was terrifying coming in. I was just like, I really hope I don't have to go through that, because that just sounds really scary. Like, that's kind of the primordial fear that we all have. So I went in the first night with the intention of asking Mother Ayahuasca to be gentle on me and to just kind of like ease me into it. Somehow she gently allowed me to experience my own death over and over and over again. And when I say over and over again, I just mean like for hours, just like I was dying and then being reborn and dying and being reborn. And if I was listening to somebody say this on camera before coming to do ayahuasca, I would just feel like it's the most terrifying thing in the world. But the weird thing is that it actually was like so incredibly peaceful. It was so sublime. My meditation practice that I've been doing for a long time really helped me stay mindful of the fact that, yes, it did feel like my body was dying or my thoughts were getting discombobulated. Kind of felt like just a letting go of everything that I know myself to be, which in retrospect I realized was really just an ego death. While it was like very overwhelming, I think somehow it was so peaceful and sublime, and every time that I did die and sort of cross over to the other side, I noticed that I was still there. On one level, like, I'm dying, but then I'd just be lying there and be like, but I'm still here, like I'm still conscious. And that was really fascinating, because just to share a quick story, like, my grandmother was actually dying in the hospital, and my whole family was by her bedside in India, my mom's mom, and I watched her die. I watched her pass away, like, on her bed. And I just remember her being so peaceful and calm, even though she was like in a lot of pain and was like coughing and wasn't doing great. And obviously all of us were really sad watching it, but she was so peaceful, and it always stuck with me. It was the first time I saw somebody just like go from alive to dead in front of my own eyes. I never understood how somebody could feel so peaceful like in that moment. Then on Monday night, I experienced that in myself. I experienced the peace of, if you can just let go and surrender, you realize that there is this infinite, timeless awareness behind your mortal experience on this earth as a human that is untouchable and is just full of light and love. And I realize as I'm saying this, it's like, might be difficult to understand having not gone through it. As I was dying and doing so peacefully, it made me think of my grandmother, and it made me realize that she was really at peace when she went. And that really helped me come to terms with her death and my own death. Obviously, I don't want to die. I want to still live and live a good, healthy, long life. But I'm no longer as afraid of death. And what I realized in the integration afterwards, which rhythmia does a great job of just helping you process these experiences, is that this fear of death was actually driving all the other fears in my life. Just this constant undertone of anxiety with everything that I'm doing. And I just feel like a lot more peaceful and able to process difficult emotions when they come up, because I know that literally everything is impermanent, but the one thing that isn't is this loving awareness. Yeah, it was really powerful. It's something you read about in a lot of spiritual texts and Buddhist. I'm really into Buddhism and Hinduism. Kind of half believe it, like it sounds good, but part of you kind of doesn't trust it until you have an experience like that. So I'm just so thankful for the medicine and really happy and proud of myself for going through this experience.
Going through an ayahuasca journey isn't always easy. But at Rhythmia, Jerry, the shamans, and the whole staff go above and beyond in supporting and preparing everyone for their journey and transformation. During his orientation, Jerry gives everyone an explanation of how an ayahuasca experience works. He describes that there are 4 main types of journeys. The first kind is called a body journey. Essentially, the medicine goes into your body and will identify what blockages are within you that stop you from fulfilling your healing intention. Then, it will help you remove those blockages through a process called purging. Now don't worry, purging is not as scary as it sounds. It's a very natural part of the ayahuasca experience where we release old, stagnant emotions within us. These energies can be released in a number of ways: laughing, burping, yawning, dancing, going to the bathroom, or even, of course, throwing it up. In order to explain why we need to purge in the first place, Jerry explains it with this analogy. Imagine the following scene.
Hey, turn that music off! F you, Dad! What did you just say?
I said I love you, Dad.
Damn right.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
When this event takes place, the boy here is essentially swallowing his emotional turmoil. All of the anger and frustration from this experience is pent up and sealed away inside. And don't be mistaken, there is sealed up pain in the father too. As the boy lives his life, experiences like this happen in a number of ways. Maybe there are bullies at school, his boss yells at him, his partner cheats on him. Whatever it is, these traumatic experiences build up over time, which paves the way for all manner of life problems. While these experiences may seem like temporary events, they have long-lasting roots that dig into our subconscious, silently affecting our thought process, our decisions, and even our health throughout our lives. So what ayahuasca does is help you pull up those roots, releasing the emotional trauma that was built up within you. And as mentioned, there are a number of ways this can happen. There have been a few instances where I've heard people say things like, "Oh yeah, I was yawning for an hour straight and felt so much better afterwards." Or even, "I danced the night away and now I feel amazing." Then again, sometimes it can get pretty crazy. Personally, I've had my share of violent purging, to be certain. However, what I've learned is this: while it can sometimes be painful to go through, once that energy is out of you, healing and love quickly comes to those old wounds, and you are free from the pain forever. With all of that said, purging is only one of the 4 types of journeys. The second and third types are very connected. The second is called a pinta, which is where you begin to see visions. There's literally no limit to what you can see. Maybe it'll be swirls of light and color. People often see sacred geometry. You might even see people you know or animals you've had in your life. But if one of your visions makes contact with you and begins to talk with you, now you've moved to the third type of journey, which is called a consult, when the subject of your vision is now engaged with you in some form of communication. And now the final type of journey is extremely rare and is considered to be the most prized. It's called a nada. And what happens is that the medicine essentially puts you to sleep and you don't even seem to experience anything. The Colombian tradition believes that what is happening here is that the spirit of the medicine puts you to sleep to go deep through your ancestral lineage in your genetic history and repair trauma and huge events from your past lifetimes or those of your family bloodlines. When you come out of it, you may not have directly experienced any visions or purging, but you may suddenly find yourself knowing something new or feeling more evolved than you previously had. After these orientation talks, there is always much anticipation for the first ceremony. People are engaged in mindful conversations and thoughtful contemplations, preparing themselves for the journey to come. Soon, the day grew to evening, and the first ceremony was about to begin. People lined up in front of the maloca, ready for anything.
Tell us, how are you feeling before this first ayahuasca ceremony?
I am feeling, and that's what it is.
Pretty excited. I'm just scared, that's all I have to say. Just horrified.
Really great, just had a cleanse and a shower and ready to get in contact with the divine.
Excellent.
I don't want to label it as excitement or nervousness or anxiety, but it's just rather ready to do it and trying to not have any expectations about what's going to happen. Just embrace it with my arms open.
No, seriously, I'm humbled. I'm nervous. I'm grateful, and I'm just ready. I'm just ready to go. Just ready to try it.
I just want to see what Aya has to show me and tell me, connect with Mother Earth.
Do you have any intentions or thoughts or questions that you're hoping to be answered?
No, I just want to. I kind of want to just go inside myself and just see what happens.
As a rule of rhythmia and most Aya ceremonies, this is a cell phone and camera-free environment. The shamans sometimes make a joke saying, "We're here to meet God, not meet them on Facebook." Fortunately, there's no rule against animating an ayahuasca ceremony, so get ready for some more cartoons. Throughout the week, John and I filmed short interviews with ourselves and others, and when the week was over, we took a look back to see what we had captured.
Last night was great. I had a really fun time and kind of lost in my thoughts, but in a good way. A lot of really nice positive thoughts, reflecting on like a lot of things that I love, a lot of people that I love, and I was digging the music, and I felt like dancing, but it didn't really feel like it was part of the night. But when the music really came on, like it was really fun to let loose.
I didn't have any feeling after the first shot until I had a first purge, which was going to the toilet, came back, and then I started feeling it. And the first thing that came to me was I was a bug, like a little bug. And then I felt like all this sensation as a bug in my body. And like, oh my God, I was looking at my hand, like a bug, like everything. It was a great feeling. And then I felt all the wind and trees and plants, other bugs, animals talking to me. And it was a pleasant feeling. And then the next thing I realized was I became an animal. I don't remember what animal I was, but I was an animal, a hairy animal. Same thing, I was talking to the nature. And then another thing happened was I became a wolf. I remember that because I saw my children, my family next to me. It's like a husky looking wolf. I was in Siberia, like looking over the like stars and like at night on the snow. And then I realized I could be anything in the nature, like anything that's living. I can be any of this. It felt so good. And I had another purge, so I had to go to the toilet, so it kind of paused, came back, lay down again, and I became my boyfriend. I was him. And it felt so good and weird and like interesting, like, oh my God. I had a exact same hand that he has. I felt just like him, and I felt how much he loves me, which sometimes we doubt, you know, like, do our parents or my partner really love me? Sometimes, like, completely cleared. And then the next thing, I was Alberto, the really, really nice dude that we met. Like, I love Alberto, and I became him. I'm like, oh my God, I even had his accent, Peruvian Spanish accent. I'm like, oh my God. And then this came to me. I am you, I'm everyone. I'm anything in the world. And if I don't like something that other people do to me, it's because I have it in me. It's just me. All the good things, all the bad things, I have everything, and I'm one, and we are all one. That's the best experience I've ever in my life. And after that, my journey ended, and I felt such a good feeling, like, this is it, I figured. Yeah, that was my best experience ever in my life.
Mother Ayahuasca, the whole time, she was just sort of trying to get me to be still. And in a lot of the ceremonies, I just didn't move at all. I just stayed very, very still and very centered. And throughout all my life, from maybe being 5 years old or so, I'd been diagnosed with really severe anxiety and also depression. I found the depression pretty easy to manage, but my anxiety for most of my life was pretty out of control. And all my thoughts would always be very aggressive and intense and just constantly repeating. And after my first ceremony of ayahuasca, I felt so still. All my whole presence and everything in my body just was in a complete stillness. I can't even describe how amazing and how beautiful it felt to truly be still for the first time in my life. And it was just so amazing to have my anxiety cured in a single night after a single ceremony. So I think I've sort of changed, and I feel the ability, I'm able to be still and be present.
You know, I never drunk or smoked prior to this. I never did any of that. So I went straight from being 100% sober to the mother. Monday we did breath work. I never did breath work like that. And what came out of me was this spirit of laughter. I was just laughing so hard. Fast forward a little bit, the first day was the craziest day because it revealed to me, it showed me how everything we process, everything we watch, everything we eat, everything we do becomes a part of us. And it showed me that because when I took the medicine, a lot of times they use breath. I guess, that's how they channel the spirits. After the drink, they say, whoosh. And within 10 minutes of me taking my first drink, I was out on the ground. And then that's when they started the music and dancing around and doing the chanting. And that's when they started the smoke. Instantly, I was out of it. And I saw them dancing around and I was like, oh Lord, shit, they got me now. They about to harness my organs. They done led me here. Yeah, and I ain't told my family about this. How did I let them set me up? That's the first thing. Instantly, what I first experienced was fear. I'm thinking like, oh my gosh, now I can't move. Now I'm stuck and I'm about to die. And I did die. I died over 1,000 times, man, and I couldn't get up. And some people call that sleep paralysis. But I couldn't get up. But I was kind of conscious of what was going on. And I've never been drunk, but I can imagine what drunk felt like. And I was like fading out and can't move and just like, and feeling real sluggish. Something wanted to throw up, but it got stuck here. I can remember me beating on the ground because I was like, I gotta make it out of here. I went to hell, dude. I was in hell, man. I was in hell. I felt so much suffering, so much pain. And my girl, sometimes she had panic attacks. And I used to always think like, that's in your head, you just tripping. Why do you always act like that? But for the first time, bro, I went to a world that was nothing but pain, nothing but stress, nothing but loss of hope. And I kept beating. I felt my heart trying to pound and crawl out of that place, right? But I died. Every time I died, it's like the more I got conscious that it was happening. And I kept beating my chest, telling myself I exist, because I was getting lost in the agony and the pain, and it felt like it was going on forever. Your heart is burnt. Your skin is, your flesh is burnt, and it comes back and it's burnt again. And I literally went through that, and if I had a count on it, I would say 1,000 times. It's just agony. Time of the gods and time of us is different. So even though it felt like 5 minutes, dude, it was years. I've been in that place. It was 5 minutes on this physical plane. One of the things I kept saying I exist because I got lost in existence. I died so many times, dude, I lost my mind. What Mother was doing was killing that side, was detoxing that energy that I was processing and I was going along to believe true. One of the things, shout out to Amanda J-Ro. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna marry her when I get back home, bro. She was one of the things that kept me alive, bro. I got so lost in myself, man. It was so much agony. And one thing I asked Mother for, was compassion. But how can you have compassion if you never felt a level of pain, if you've never been through certain things, even on a vibrational level that others have been through, to be able to relate? And I felt so bad for how many times I left her in the dark and I shamed her about it. How I made her curl up. Not only did she have to battle in the spiritual world, but she didn't even feel safe on the physical world. And me as her man and looking at as the provider, I couldn't even be that for her. I was too immature to be that for her. And Lord knows I cried for her so that night. My soul cried for her, man. When I woke up, I was being taken through time. I was being pulled through time. And it was almost like I was being Jesus, I was being Buddha, I was being so much people. And it was like the medicine said, this is who you are. It was so weird. And then I remember doing like this dance and it was like, ooh, I come by, I come by. And it was like this beautiful African dance where I was this big dude and I didn't have too much clothes on. From that dance, it was like people saw me doing it. They walked by. It was like I was in a different world doing it. And they just came and hugged me, real tribal, and said, he's back. He's back. I cried so much, dude. Before this experience, I was a man that prided myself in being able to hold my own. And because my father told me men don't cry. But that's what happens at the split. Our ego creates this separate identity that allows us to live in the world that we're living in. I just recognized, bro, how strong and how hard they rose me to be in it, and how insensitive I was to people and people in this world, bro. And now my heart is just so open, bro. When your soul and your ego dies in that way, bro, oh my gosh, man. And that was just the first thing.
It began with a deep spiritual rebirth. There was this moment where I was split into two bodies. One was a very defeated masculine boy, and one was a dead body of a female. We were put into a pot by a great being and boiled to a crazy inferno that created all of this smoke that shot up, all of the energy of residual of those two parts of myself were destroyed and alchemically reconstructed into a new body. And then a being was over me, over this new body, and blew into my nostrils the breath of life. I emerged as an awoken new creature, as a new thing, as a new human. And standing over me were actually two beings. One was Thoth, and the other was Enki. And they were smiling at me, being like, welcome. Welcome to your new life. Enki left me in Thoth's care and went off, and Thoth and I stayed together for so much of the ceremony, and he guided me to be wise.
And I also had a lot of visuals last night. Like, I would take my glasses off and like things are blurry, but instead of just being blurry, those blurs would like turn into all these like really interesting geometries, which was pretty wild. And like just like I start seeing that, and you start just like kind of my mind would wander and start imagining all these things. And there's other visuals too last night. Like there was one point where I was laying on a hammock, kind of just in awe by the stars, and I thought I saw this like bird flying, and then it just disappeared. And what was really neat is that after I told Shane about that, he was like, hey, I was out on the hammocks the same time you were on the hammock, and I felt like I was getting attacked by a bird. So it was kind of neat to have that connection of like, I saw a bird go by and it crashed into Shane, which is pretty funny.
I had an experience where my intention was about letting go. It was about, why do I always feel the need to like do so much or hold on to things or like want to do all this stuff. And halfway through the experience, I get this sharp pain in my back, and my back starts seizing up. I'm usually pretty comfortable with the medicine, but there was a point in this experience where it just kept getting worse and worse, and I felt like I needed help. And I remember saying, Jesus Christ, like my back hurts, and all of a sudden Jesus pops into my awareness, and I'm like, wow. And he wasn't like the Jesus you would expect with like, you know, robes and like the throne crown of thorns. He was like a cool modern day Jesus. And I was like, Jesus, is that you? And he was like, yeah, you know it's me. And I'm like, what do you ask Jesus? And I was like, what's it like to be Jesus? And I'm instantly taken into this experience where I'm being crucified on a cross, and my back pain is just getting more intense. But as I'm realizing, because at first I didn't realize what was going on, but I'm realizing as I'm ascending and I'm feeling this feeling, I can see a crowd of faceless people, but I can see their energy bodies, and I could see this feeling of nothing but compassion and forgiveness. That was the only feeling, and there was zero pain. There was zero pain. As long as my awareness was on that, there was zero pain. It was about totally letting go. And that was the teaching. And so then I think, did I meet Jesus? Did I experience what he experiences? But I think maybe not, who knows? What I do know is the medicine provided me that experience that I needed to understand what I was asking for. And that was the best way it could communicate to me. It was by having that experience and seeing it was nothing but pure love and forgiveness and compassion. And then the same night I ended up meeting John Lennon and Buddha in this wild sort of change of events, but both of them had the same message. Buddha was just like, you don't get it, just let it be. It's just about let go. It's just about being. Try to explain this in thousands of texts. It's the same thing. It's just let go. And John Lennon was like, let it be. By the end of that, we were all singing Let It Be, Meet Jesus and Buddha, and I was laughing. I couldn't believe what was going on. It was like a mix of like, I wasn't sure if this is my imagination or is this really happening, or am I creating this? Is this like a part of my imagination? And what I came to the conclusion was, it's all part of this learning that I needed to have. It was creating that experience that would be most impactful and memorable for me, right?
So was after that whole thing, did your back still hurt?
No, that was totally gone. Like yeah, no back pain at all. It was like, by the end of it, it was gone. Like as soon as I started realizing what the teaching was, right? Where I was probably holding on to something before that. Oh, it was interesting.
The night that I merged back with my soul and was able to find a new heart, after I put everything behind me, all my intentions, all the hate, anger, anxiety, depression, worry, judgment, resentment, all that stuff towards my father, which was one of the biggest causes. That was like one of the roots. And after my ego was just dissolved to its fullest, I saw myself as a little boy We were holding hands on a cliff, looking out into the wilderness. Something asked me if I was ready, and that question to me was I ready to become one with that little boy again? And we went from holding hands to becoming one. After I became one with that little boy again, I found myself going through a jungle. This jungle is a place that I've always had in my mind, like during certain meditation to get rid of anxiety. This time, as I was traveling through the jungle, I came upon a floating heart. I just grabbed it as fast as I could and held on to it. I just started buzzing with such an insane intensity, and something just told me to relax, and I could feel something at the top of my chest, and it was telling me that that was putting that new heart inside of me. I've never cried like that before. It was insane, but I loved it. It was everything I ever wanted. I no longer care about anything that I used to care about that would hurt me. It's like I've just put it all behind me. There's really nothing to worry about anymore, or at all. It's all so beautiful. I just, before, chose to not see the beauty. But when you do see the beauty, it overrides all the negative things in this world, it seems. I just feel free from everything. I feel rhythmia was the key to everything. Just brought everything together. Without it, I'm not sure if I would be able to complete the process. So I appreciate everything that has to do with rhythmia, all the people I've met, all my friends. I've also never felt a love that I feel here before, and that's beautiful. I'm excited to take that back with me.
It was a profound experience being here. I thought it was a vacation. I'm very, very overworked at work. And I said, I'm just gonna take a nice vacation in Costa Rica and relax. So when I got here, it was amazing. Everything was beautiful. I was feeling better already. And I was so excited to go in my first ayahuasca ceremony. So wrong. It is not a vacation, but it's so much better than a vacation. My first experience was terrifying, but I learned so much. My second experience was one of the most profound and mystical experiences of my life. I went past my comfort zone and I kept hearing the message say, you know, go to what's hard, don't go to what's easy. The universe rewards bravery. So I went up for a second drink and I knew that that was the thing I had to do, but I was so scared and so weak. But I crawled and I knew I had to do it. I just crawled and I found my courage and I stood up in front of the shaman and I'm like, hey, guess what? You know, I'm not afraid anymore. And he looked at me and he goes, happy birthday. And he gave me my other drink. And I drank that and I thought that this has to be the cap of my experience. But it wasn't. It wasn't. It was a whirlwind of ego beating throughout the rest of the ceremonies. I learned so much about humanity and what drives humanity and what exactly the earthly plane is. And on the last day was the purging day. I was a bit scared, but I knew I could handle it. I was kind of sick of really bad, scary, intense experiences that I said I just want to have fun. And so I took the thing and I didn't purge for a long, long time until the shamans dusted me off with feathers in a circle and all of a sudden I could feel myself dying. I became so enraptured in everything all at once. It was so surreal, I couldn't stop it because usually before I just opened my eyes, but I couldn't open my eyes and everything was just death and dying. I fell to the floor softly and then all of a sudden I started thrashing my legs around. They had to carry me out and I didn't know what was happening at first. But then, I don't know what happened, but I was pinned to the ground, not by anyone, but by my imagination. And I started seeing through lights and lights and lights and lights, and my whole body turned to energy. And lights were everywhere, and I could feel someone orchestrating, like a shaman, a particular shaman, orchestrating my whole experience. And I felt my body being renewed at that time, which was amazing, and everything collapsing, expanding, collapsing, expanding, collapsing, expanding, and then going from one consciousness to the next and every single answer in the universe was being revealed to me. One by one, I flipped over another answer, flip over another answer, flip over another answer, and then everything was just connected and everything had an order and everything had a reason. And I knew that everything was connected. Nothing happened by accident. I was so certain about that. And I could feel all this love around me. That was me. And I could also feel like the shaman and his love, like guiding the whole process. So it was more like feeling a safety that I could experience this for myself. And when I woke up, I just felt whole, like completely whole and certain that I've ever felt in my life.
On plant medicine, on ayahuasca, I think the most amazing thing I've ever seen is the Castle of Divinity. It started out as a snake and it turned into a woman that her beauty transcends description. And then from that, it turned into a palace. And in that, while looking at that palace, it showed how life works. A part of it was focused on the earth. And it was focused at the smallest minutiae. And you could see people hating each other. And then it went up maybe 10,000 feet. And then it looked a little different. And it keeps, the further you get away from it, the more peaceful it becomes. And it might look crazy, but it's perfectly orchestrated like an ant colony. I can't hurt you without hurting me, and I can't help you without helping me. And that the overriding glue that holds the whole thing together is love. Even though it can look like so many different things, even anger is a shade of love. And how there's this one soul that we're all from, and that anything that happens to us is even beyond good or evil. It's of this divine order. And even though it doesn't look, and I hate to talk like this because it seems fragmented and shit, but even the worst, most horrendous crimes are still under the arc of love. It's crazy to understand, and we're all playing our part, and it's up to us to decide when we no longer want to play the part that we were playing. We want to play something different, yeah. And then we move that, and then someone else moves into our. It's this crazy thing, dude.
After the whole week of experiences, we were amazed by the transformation that we saw take place. With every person we talked to, we heard stories like these and were left in awe of the beauty and majesty of what had been created there in just 1 week. Throughout the week, we also made it a point to interview some of the Rhythmia staff and ask them about the nature of the work that they do there.
When somebody remerges with their soul, the change in their affect and the way that they're being is priceless. And I get to see that 60, 100 times a week. And to that person, it's the single most important story in the world. And that's why we treat each one of these people as if it were ourselves, yeah. Because once you do the medicine, you see that it is you. And it's easier to do that. It's easier to treat that person as an extension of yourself. And that's this whole place. When people say, when they leave, they say, oh yeah, it was a pretty place and all that. But the real thing was the way that they were held while they were here.
So the breathwork and the plant medicine make a really good team. The breathwork can really help in a gentle way open us up to start feeling some of our feelings that maybe we've tucked away for a while, like maybe decades. And then introducing us into the plant medicine where things can get a little bit more intense. And then using the breathwork through your plant medicine ceremonies to really keep you calm and keep you centered. So when things get a little bit crazy, a little bit intense, a lot of things are coming up in the plant medicine, always returning to your breath to keep you in a calm, grounded place. And then we also like to end the week of ceremonies here with a more intense breathwork session. And it's amazing how it can really tie up loose ends for us. So things that have happened during ceremony and maybe there's a little bit of confusion or maybe a little loose ends, and the breathwork can help to pull that together. And it can also help you take some of those experiences back home. So it's a tool that you can use every day at home.
The late, great Terrence McKenna, he likes to say that the shaman is a mixture of the doctor, the scientist, and the artist. Somebody who has put themselves through healing and has gone through those situations and has done the medicine enough to that they can show that to other people as well. And there's a lot of shamans out there. If somebody has an inkling in their heart that they're a truth seeker, knowing that they're not alone in this world, never, then there is a path for them. And the medicine really wakes us up to that, the shaman within.
The most amazing thing is the ceremony, and it's always just seeing all the love and the healing. It's always that. There's nothing more than that. It's just, I'm always blown away by just the pure love and the connection and the energy and the healing that provides for everybody.
If you look around and you look at the nature of the trees, everything it's in perfect order. It's always in perfect harmony, right? But us as humans, somewhere along the line, like we got out of that harmony through going to school and learning about having a career and this and that. But like if you go to the jungle and you see how they live, like they live one with nature. They live in harmony. Right? So the medicine is helping us to remember that us too, as humans, we're nature. And bringing us back to that harmony.
At the end of the week, there is a closing group workshop designed around the process of reintegration. After entering such a high vibrational state, going back into the world you came from can be a little challenging. Fortunately, Rhythmia provides excellent support for the people going back to their homes and their lives.
There is this adjustment period and how it works. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the moon told me, so I said to her, I said, well, why did I feel like I didn't think I wasn't sure if I got it here. And then when I was over here, I got this feeling that I got it. And she said it comes down to worthiness. That in the first, after you get it, there's this worthiness thing that you go through, that am I worthy to hold this? And I asked her, I said, how long does it last? And she said, you can't undo it. You can only re-screw it. You can't undo the connection. You can only screw it up again. And she also said that at last, if you keep this clean, that even death does not take it away from you.
When you take the medicine, you may come out with a deeper knowing about the importance of meditation, eating well, daily spiritual practice, and things like this. Going back to the world, it's important to keep up our spiritual efforts in order to maintain our higher vibration. Otherwise, it's possible to fall back to a denser state of being with poor habits or being unengaged with yourself and your life. However, even despite this, after just 1 week of these ceremonies, we hear overall that there is more faith, more knowing, and more connectedness than ever before. Even if some old habits return, which is entirely on us, there is this deep knowing that everything that happens in our lives is all a part of some bigger picture. And in this way, we learn what it truly means to be connected to everything.
That society screaming for somebody to see the truth, capital T truth. So instead of getting entrenched in it, we try to see possibilities. Then as you just said, we ask, what is it that's mine to do that will alleviate suffering? And so everyone here can't do the same thing because everyone has different gifts. Everyone can't do everything, but everyone can do something. So we have to ask, what does my gift allow me to do? You pull out from the undertow. You hold a high space, and then you ask, what is it that's mine to do? And as an artist, that's what you have to do. You have to speak of possibility. You have to speak of vision. You have to speak of purpose. You have to speak of the next stage, the answer that's trying to happen. One by one, two by two, we come together to create that field for the emergence of the next stage.
After we returned home from Rhythmia, a week later, I invited John to the office and asked him a couple of in-closing questions.
Ending with the sun coming up was a surreal experience, but I think having such a long night and, really having the medicine kind of compile over the few days inside of me, it was super introspective. I felt like every night there was more and more visuals. So I was seeing lots of really interesting patterns, lots of colors on things, and just kind of taking a new look on things and really coming to terms with some things. And I would say not even just the fourth night, but the fourth night capped it off, but I do feel like after all of that, I'm a better person. After this experience, made me really sort everything out in my head, you know, like if there's anything I was kind of doubting about maybe what I want to do in the future, and you know, I mentioned already what makes me happy, it really kind of sorted it out. It put things in a very clear lens. So I kind of really sure about what I want to do and like just how I want to live my life, and just, yeah, I think that's probably the best way to put it. It really helps put things in perspective. Yeah, it really, like, it's like a jam-packed mega reflection therapy session on your brain and stuff. Is wild, man. And the visuals, yeah.
As for me, when I came home, I found that my evolution experience was only just beginning. There was a shift within me. For so long, I'd been playing the role of a kid who makes videos on the internet. It was a role I'd been playing for so many years now. That was my comfort zone. But after this trip to rhythmia, the professional within me came alive. I realized that in order to truly live my dreams of having a large video production studio and creating spirit centers across the world, it was time for me to step up into a higher place of leadership and responsibility in my life. With this newfound evolution, the people in my life began to change too. I naturally began to attract other conscious and spiritual experts who could help me grow and take spirit science to the next level. At the end of the day, this was the evolution I experienced, and it's still going on even as I make this movie. But really, one of the most humbling lessons I've learned above all else is that it's not about me. It's about all of us learning and growing together, healing together, and a massive change for all of humanity.
We're not doing this for the same thing that motivates most people to start a business, right? So our initial motivation is different. Because of that, growth is not a real high priority to me. I want to always get better at what we're doing, you know? So if it gets a little bigger, it gets a little bigger. What I'd really like to have happen is it to become a huge success. And so other people open them up, not me, so that other people open them up all over the world, that this thing does so well. And when I say so well, I do mean financially, but I also mean that the healings that occur are so deep and so many that people in conventional medicine and government has to say, look at this, look what happened here, and then starts a movement away from traditional healing centers, more to centers like this, where they're not just giving you a pill to not have a headache for a day, but removing that headache for the rest of your life. Like this is real. This is really real.
One of the most memorable things is there was a woman who was purging a lot, and then after she was done purging, I was there for her, got her some tissue, give her a sip of water, and then she wanted to go out and watch the stars, you know, be outside, so I helped her outside. And then she stopped and looked outside like it was the first time she's ever seen the world. And then she told me, she said, I just purged out my cancer. And then after she went home, she ended up going to the doctor, and you know, the cancer was gone. And then she still comes back and she still does more work, because there's always more healing to do. You know, the medicine isn't just a doctor, but she is a teacher, and there's always more healing, revealing, you know, getting back to who we truly are.
The importance of plant medicine is that we're moving into union with a consciousness, with the energy, an energy and a union that we have lost, right? In 1850, Wordsworth writes, the world is too much with us, getting and spending late, and soon we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. Right? This is the connectivity that the plant provides us. We get back into the connections and rhythms of life and nature. We see the truth of something beyond what we see with the eyes and ears. You know, what Reverend Micah would say, we see the invisible. We hear the inaudible. And it allows us to do the impossible. Right? That's really the connection of plant medicine.
In the simplest form, I think most people are run by their subconscious mind. And most people are in a fight and flight state most of the time because of society, because of, you know, work, the way we're brought up, and we're so lost. And when you have an ayahuasca experience, it peels back all these layers at once. So you can really see the true essence of yourself and what's really important. And it gives you that opportunity to then make changes. Ayahuasca is not going to change your life by itself. It'll give you the opportunity to change your life. It'll present that opportunity to you. And a place like this gives you all those other support mechanisms, the cleanses, the classes, the breath work, to really give you that push and opportunity to make those changes. And then it's up to you, you know, the lessons that you learned, how you can integrate that into your daily life now, once you step off this place. And there's also amazing tools that really provides for that too. But the ayahuasca in general will do that. It makes you really want to support nature, to give back, to sort of connect with people. And that's what's gonna make the world a better place, people opening to that awareness of what their true nature is and who they really are. And the more people that can do that, it's happening. Like ayahuasca is spreading across the world right now. Plant medicine is coming into the awareness because I think the planet is raising the vibration, saying, hey, we need to sort of wake up here. Because we can change things like that if everyone is on board saying, hey, let's change the way we operate, let's change the way we treat each other and the planet. And I think ayahuasca is one of the greatest opportunities as a catalyst for change.
Yeah, I straight up believe that like anyone would benefit from going to rhythmia. Or at least doing ayahuasca, having that kind of ceremony. And I think it's super important that it's in the right setting and you have the right people, you know, the right shamans or caretakers helping you through the experience. But I think anyone would help from therapy, and I kind of see it the same way, but it's like almost like super therapy. So I think the world should do ayahuasca.
So, where do we go from here? Rhythmia is available to you right now. If you're ready for this, click the link in the description and take action now. When you take action, you pave the way for the whole world to heal. And that's real. Your own shift and healing has an enormous effect on global consciousness. Ayahuasca has made that clear. That's how connected we truly are. Now, you might be thinking, I can't afford it. And if that's the case right now, it's okay. Let me show you how you can, because the key is within you. Instead of saying, I can't afford it, which is limiting, ask yourself, how can I afford it? Which opens the door of possibility for your own energy. Have faith and be patient. Rhythmia is a part of a much bigger picture for all of us. And if you set your intention to make it happen, there's nothing that can stop you. I've met people of all walks of life at Rhythmia. There was even a 19-year-old pizza delivery boy who saved up his money for several months to go, and he said it was the best decision he'd ever made. So I stand with Jerry in hopes and dreams that one day, places like Rhythmia will exist all over the world in abundance, and the world leaders with power over social systems will see the value without question. I mean, really, what would happen if these guys were to try it?
Before I came here, my sisters never let me touch them. I would always kind of try and hug them, they'd be like, go away. And like coming here, by the second day, I received the most hugs I've gotten from them in as long as I can remember.
It was almost what they call a nada. There was not much happening, but there was a lot happening. I could feel that the medicine was working. There was a few subtle visions and things like that was helping me to see a little bit deeper into the fabric of who I am and what's been going on. But at the same time, it was more about being able to be present to the gratitude of life in general, just being open to love, open to gratitude, open to grace, open to bliss. At the end of the night, there was like sort of a purge that, and I asked what that purge was for, and it was just to purge those toxins from my system that are not serving me or my life. And today I actually feel clearer, even though I didn't get a lot of sleep or anything like that, but I feel more clear in my being, which is pretty awesome, considering that, you know, I never would have anticipated something so simple to have such an interesting effect on the following day's consciousness and feeling and that sort of stuff. So day one was pretty cool. I'm very grateful and humbled. I asked for gentle and I got gentle. So
we as a species we're coming now into glimpsing, like so many people have started to receive similar things throughout their ceremonies, but we're starting to come to a point where we're receiving this deeper understanding about how everything works. You know, we have this this perspective through science and through our religions and stuff of the way that the heavens and the world and the universe operates. But it's so much more intricate and magical than we can possibly understand at this point. But through experiences like this, through deep meditation, through plant medicine ceremonies, we're starting to get glimpses of something bigger, something beyond, and activate our DNA. And with this higher activation, it turns on something within us. It changes us to be able to see and know and receive higher truths beyond anything we've been able to know in the last 13,000 years. And that's so amazing.